like this, man. He's like a butterfly flapping his wings deep down into the forest, man. It's gonna cause a tree fall like 5,000 miles away, man. There ain't nobody seeing nobody. Man, see, like, you don't even know, man. It's like you're born into this world, man. And you got like that, man. The dust and wind, man. Or like a dang old candle, man. It don't matter, man. It's all the time.
All right, hey everyone, this is a little bit different than a normal episode. And so what I've done is cut together 3 other interviews I've done with prominent Guntubers, 2A guys. Not all on that topic, but these are faces and names you will know. Some of these are quite old, right? Like I think the oldest is 2 or 3 years now, my episode with BrassFacts. Then FocusTripp was a little bit later, and then the Hop one wasn't too long ago. So check them out. Obviously, you can find them elsewhere, but in addition to compiling them in one place, I also edited them, right? I made the audio sound better. It's something I've gotten more competent at. So back to normally scheduled programming next, but this is a convenient way to get all that content in one place. And if you're new, obviously, let me know. Glad to see you. And if there's anyone else you want me to talk to, tell me who down in the comments. All right. Thanks, guys. Appreciate it.
All right. BrassFacts. Brock, welcome to the show. How you doing, man?
I'm doing well. Thanks for having me on.
Yeah, I'm excited to have you on. A funny story of this. I reached out to you on Discord. I mean, this well over a year ago and completely forgot about it. Didn't work out. And I was just digging through your Discord group looking to sell some gear. And I was like, oh, shoot. I reached out to Brock. I should follow up on that because you did a video that was quite interesting about geopolitics. But hypothetically, my audience may not have heard of you. So could you describe kind of who you are and what you do for them?
Yeah. I'm I guess YouTube's my third string activity. I started life as a political scientist, and then that didn't really work out. So I got an engineering degree. Right about that time, I decided, you know what, I need to share my opinion about gun gear autism, and made a gun YouTube channel. And then kind of, the rest is history, as they say. But my first love, so to speak, as cringy as that sounds, well, it's probably video games. But I guess my second love would be I really like geopolitics and international relations. I really that's kind of what I wanted to do. It didn't work out for me, but you see spurts of it emerge on my channel every once in a while. So.
Is that something you were drawn to as a kid, or was there some kind of inciting incident there?
I don't know. I think it's to a degree. I think it's kind of like that male desire. They just see an F-16 and they're like, hell yeah. And to a degree, a lot of dudes kind of just end up being drawn to that. And I guess I'm drawn to that just a little bit more than most, but I've never gotten into a conversation like this with someone and they haven't been interested in it. So there's no specific moment where kind of mattered for me. I think I saw, to kind of maybe give you less of a politician's answer, I think at some point I saw somebody, explain something in geopolitical terms instead of just like the human factor of, why did George Bush invade Iraq? Well, it's a WMD, right? But then explain the actual, behind the scenes version of that. And that was very eye-opening, interesting, whatever you want to call it.
Well, definitely. And, I watched a video that you put out 2 weeks ago. This is really the genesis of this talk. And it was called When the United States Comes Home. And, I've primarily watched your stuff just because, I also have a dash of the gun autism, right? And when I saw that really perked up my ears. I was like, oh shoot, like this is the language that I speak. And your way of framing that as, kind of on a more human level than just basic, ours versus D politics is something that I'm, really interested in. And, I sort of came to that through, more explicit political thinkers, like Machiavelli, basically looking at like, okay, well, how do humans organize themselves? And obviously the kind of, meat and potatoes of politics certainly matters to a certain degree. But if you're interested in, okay, well, how do these creatures called humans organize themselves? I think that's a much more interesting conversation.
Yeah. Yeah, it's an interesting thing, and maybe we can kind of dive into that in a bit. But if you meet an individual, they're going to act as an individual. But a lot of the genesis of political science and IR, international relations, is kind of this underlying assumption that humans, at the end of the day, when you view them as, from a far enough lens as a group, tend to act in a very similar or repeatable manner to a degree.
Well, and that's what's interesting, right? If I went to business school, unfortunately, and you hear about this Pareto principle, right? The 80-20 rule. But what you don't realize is that Pareto and a number of other thinkers, right, developed that idea further to how, that same principle of, statistical like analysis of, a business or kind of like workers on a factory floor. It kind of works when we look at, again, human society. So in your video, you bring up this idea of geopolitical realism. And, political realism, which is obviously kissing cousins, it traces its lineage right to Machiavelli. And it's this idea of dealing with the world as it is versus how we would like it to be. So do you think that, one, first, that my definition of geopolitical realism is even close to right? And two, do you think that that's different from sort of an ideological conception of how the world works?
That's starting out with a banger. Yeah, I think to a degree. I mean, there's always, everyone approaches it from a slightly different angle, right? My approach is very much just a practical sense, what can be learned from geopolitics. I don't truly believe that geopolitics has political science, and specifically realist political ideology has all the answers, but it does, at minimum, a lot of our world leaders subscribe to this ideology and, the way of viewing the world. So if I can understand how they think, it kind of helps me understand why certain things can happen. I think fundamentally, yeah, it's useful to kind of view the world that way. We always made jokes in poli-sci class, laughing at the collectivists, or not collectivists, the more, I forgot what the term is, but kind
like
of
individualist libertarian types, or
not necessarily libertarian, but those that are like, oh yeah, the human, because I don't know how much your audience knows, but the realist school of thought is very much more, they black box a lot of scenarios, right? Like a country is a singular unit, all that stuff. And then, these guys come along and it's always like, no, humans have individual choice and all that. And so it's always fun to laugh about that. What was the second question before I completely got off a tangent?
Oh, well, I was just going to say, do you view realism as an ideology or something kind of different? But I guess you answered that by referring it to as an ideology.
Yeah, I think it's. I mean, in theory, it could be an absolute truth, but we'll never really know, right? There's so many holes in all of the theories that you can really only view them as an ideology, right?
Well, true. And I think that that's actually another point to look at, right? Is that, viewing an ideology, it is fundamentally a model of reality, and by virtue of being a model, it is imperfect. And I think that, you've probably read more, political science than I have, but you get to very goofy places if you decide, I have found, the one true rule for how all people work at all times, and I think that it's important to temper this. So
yeah, absolutely. I think your favorite. I think you said you read a lot of Mearsheimer. I think one of my favorite quotes from him is, this guy's on top of the IR realist world, and he says the best theory is only correct 60% of the time, and most theories are not the best theories or ideologies or whatever. And I think that really illustrates it, right? These are good, useful tools that we have to kind of view this world, because humans need a story, a way to view the world. And it does do a lot in a lot of scenarios. But yeah, if it gets very dangerous very quickly if you refuse to view the world in any other way and don't, acknowledge to yourself that these are fundamentally human constructed theories to explain why we do the way things we do.
Well, right. It's descriptive, not prescriptive. And I think that that's an important, if you were a hypothetical person evaluating a hypothetical thinker, that's a very good way to look at someone and say, okay, he's humble enough to admit that this has limited application, and I think that is a rare thing. So in your video, and it was quite a good one, I'll be sure to link it. one of the things that you bring up is this idea of the security dilemma. So do you want to explain what that term means? And then maybe we can go into it a little bit from there.
Yeah, absolutely. Let's see. How do I? So maybe a slight detour before I jump into that. A thing that I had to really struggle with making that video, for starters, it was all mostly from memory. But the second part was like, how do I explain something to an audience without belittling their intelligence, but also without just blasting way over their head and going into a shitload of detail? So so I got a lot of flack on that video from both sides of the coin. It's like, this is so basic as to be useless, or you didn't, I don't know what the hell you're talking about. But yeah, the security dilemma is essentially this assumption about how the world works at a geopolitical, mass scale. But it also does apply to, day-to-day life if you want to kind of push it that way. But it's I'll take the Mearsheimer version of the security dilemma. It's this fear of the unknown, of your opposition, that drives you to do certain things, right? That's the 10,000 foot overview. But if you kind of zoom in a little bit more, the security dilemma specifically is, hypothetically, I'm building up the strength in my country because I don't want to die, right? Because that's a thing that happens in the world. If you have no military, you'll get taken over. And another country does the same thing. Us, without being able to read that other person's mind and having any way to truly trust them, there are no systems in place for that, will see his very large buildup of the military, even if it's only defensive in nature, and get nervous myself. And then, my side of the table starts building up my military, and then his side of the table starts building up the military. I start viewing his intentions that were purely defensive in nature as a prospect for buildup. And this kind of ping-pongs back and forth until you get what essentially is an arms race or something to that effect. Now, there are different ways to kind of, apply this to the real world. But the big fundamental issue that kind of makes the security dilemma spicy is that in a lot of times throughout human history, offense was favored over defense. So you get this thing where you can't trust the enemy and you don't know their intentions, and you see this buildup. And then you add the final piece to the pie of the security dilemma, and that is offense is very much favored over defense. So you get a lot of preemptive action. It kind of leads to a situation where war seems to happen when no one actually wants war to happen. Ooh, wasn't the best explanation, but
no, I think you did it definitely. And one of the things that flows from that is that idea that it's actually very difficult to say who started a war. You hear a lot and I think a lot of it is sort of posturing for international opinion, right? But it's the idea of like, they struck us first. But if you look at kind of an older understanding of this, it's like, well, did you really? Right? It's like what you said, there's a buildup before. There's some posturing, there's kind of both, in many cases, both societies kind of get on a war footing. And so it's like watching a fist fight, right? You see two guys square up, they maybe start saying things toward each other. And then one of them throws a punch. And it's like, okay, from like a go to jail perspective, yes, he started the fight. Okay. But did he really? Right? This was sort of a mutual thing. And I think that's something to bear in mind as well when we come to that question of like, can you ever really get rid of conflict? Because a lot of what we're talking about is based on this idea that, there's sort of inbuilt facets to human organization, human nature. And at least from my perspective, it seems like, as awful as conflict is, as awful as war is, it's sort of fundamental to humans, right? I don't think we can ever get around that. And I think that the security dilemma and that idea of, offensive realism, sometimes it is logical to take the first swing. I think it kind of prevents us from ever getting around conflict. Yeah.
And for those in the audience that might want to read more into this, security dilemma is a play on the prisoner's dilemma. And the prisoner's dilemma is a thought experiment to illustrate why, when two entities are benefited from working together, right? So in the geopolitical sense, it's not going to war. Why they end up going to war? But in the prisoner's dilemma, it's two prisoners that are, they work together on a crime, and now they're being arrested. And if neither of them tell on each other, they don't go to jail. But the risk of going to jail, just look it up. It's a thought experiment, and it kind of explains at a very basic level what exactly the security dilemma is.
But I think that that's interesting as well, because obviously you're in the preparedness space. And one of the things that I think is interesting about that space, and we'll go back to the topic at hand, is that you sort of have kind of two expectations, right? And one is much more popular than the other. And it's this sort of kind of like unspecified vision of Mad Max, right? Where it's like something bad will happen and it will turn into, like the Hobbesian all versus all. It'll just be like raiders wearing like leather and, eating people's faces. And, when you look at a situation, where there is scarce resources, right? What we call an economic scarcity. And there are people who have kind of aims contrary to one another. Conflict certainly arises. But again, right, at least when we kind of like map this out, it's generally a logical decision, right? Very few people are these kind of like absolute psychopaths. And so I'm curious, do you see that kind of like a prisoner's dilemma situation? Do you see that in a like a hypothetical like loss of rule of law, or do you think it only applies to these large kind of like institutions? You still there?
Yeah, sorry. It's a much more complicated question to answer in that dynamic, because a lot of what the prisoner's dilemma is a very insulated example, and the security dilemma kind of makes like I said, black boxes a lot of stuff where it assumes these countries are single entities and they're operating on very linear kind of paths. When as soon as you start bringing humans in, you begin to see the pitfalls of these hyper simplified theories, right? So I think, yeah, you could absolutely come up with a scenario where, especially if you get a little more flexible with definitions, where, yeah, there are certain scenarios where humans don't fundamentally just want to be left alone to do their own thing. But in a post-collapse, you don't even need to go as hardcore as Mad Max post-collapse. You can go to, temporary loss of rule of law, partial loss of rule of law. You can even go to just minor civil unrest. And we've seen some of that where, on one hand, we have the fundamental truth that people generally want to be left alone, but competing interests, competing desires, and then, sprinkle in some, four horsemen of the apocalypse of frustration, class inequality. And you get a bunch of people just fundamentally doing things that are bad or against each other, right?
Fair enough. So the next point I want to bring up is, you mentioned in this that part of the reason for this kind of desire to kind of instigate a conflict is that effectively the consequences for losing the game of power are quite severe. So one, what would you say those consequences are? And is that something that has kind of changed recently, or are those, roughly the same over time?
I'm assuming we're talking back at the geopolitical level, right?
Yeah, sorry. I that was a brief digression. Now we're back to what we're actually supposed to be talking about instead of some random question that popped into my head.
Yeah, no worries. I just want to be making sure I don't go off on a diatribe on the wrong thing. Yeah, I mean, you can kind of look at history. You can even look at current events to what happens to countries that aren't adequately prepared, and the circumstance kind of comes together and they get invaded and then they just get destroyed, right? I think in recent history, we kind of look over certain countries that have lost war, to such an extreme level that they get, completely defeated, right? There's partial defeat and complete defeat. And sometimes it paints the wrong image, right? America was very generous to the countries she defeated in World War II, but you only need to dial back history and realize how many countries that no longer exist. And, it's going to depend from person to person and how nationalistic you are, how much you care about your culture, so on and so forth. But at least from my perspective, beyond the innate desire for reproduction and the fact that your civilization is being wiped out, essentially, there's also, cultural stuff. I'm very proud of, my culture. I'm very proud of my history. I'm very proud of so-and-so. I will die eventually, but that will remain. But if your country gets destroyed, completely annihilated, you are potentially, depending on how well history is kept and how generous the state that defeated you is, you may either see that history completely erased, modified to be more flattering towards them, or completely altered, you name it, right? So I think that's probably one of the worst things that could ever happen to a culture.
Well, and I think that you see that even in what some thinkers had planned for Germany, right? The extremes of, right, the Morgenthau plan, which is this idea that Germany would never be allowed to be a people at all. They'd be reduced to a subsistence agriculture. And obviously that dude was nuts, and whatever you say about denazification, that didn't happen. Or even on the ancient scale, right, with like tribal warfare, right? This idea that everyone would be killed, right? The women would be taken away. Some people would be taken as slaves, and effectively one group would completely erase another. The example I always go back to on this is a book called Scalp Dance, right, which is sort of a chronicle of the wars with the Plains Indians, and that was sort of this mutual war of destruction, right? There were these horrible massacres on both sides, where effectively, it wasn't like what we would like Napoleonic War. It was like, okay, well, you've lost, so the general gives me his sword. We exchange, sort of a salute, and then I give you your sword back because you were an honest guy, and we signed some papers. It was basically, okay, you've lost. Now, if I find your village, it's gone. There's nothing left. And obviously, I don't want to go back to that. That's a bad thing. But that is sort of the kind of like programming in the back of your brain to avoid losing at all costs, right? Is to avoid that sort of like genetic erasure.
Yeah. And who knows if we're ever going to go back to that. I think humanity has gotten better about not completely annihilating cultures from the history books to a degree, I think. So it's hard to say if we're ever going to have another, American, Indians versus the Western colonizers situation where they just get completely blasted, for the lack of a better term. Or, Poland eventually came out of it, but Poland's kind of to a degree, not a joke of history, but a good example of a country that on paper is fundamentally very powerful, but keeps kind of getting the shaft for 50 to 100 year increments.
Yeah, there are very few worse positions to be in than Poland in the last 250 years. They really got the shaft.
Yeah.
So one of the other things you mentioned is this idea of hegemon. Can you explain what you mean when you say that phrase?
Yeah. So in geopolitics, typically stuff is divided into major powers, minor powers, and then occasionally regional powers. And that distinction is essentially, right, like, I don't know, if you've ever played Hearts of Iron, right, there's some overpowered countries and some underpowered countries, and then there's some really overpowered countries. I think everyone fundamentally understands it, right? A Germany or a UK or France is fundamentally just from a military standpoint, which is what a lot of geopolitics care about, is fundamentally just a quote unquote better nation than a Greece or a Denmark, right? So those would be the distinctions between a minor power and a major power. And then you get to something like potentially like a regional power, which is kind of an extension of that, where it's able, the major powers in the regions aren't just competing, but one of them is able to kind of get to a point where it is the dominant power of that region. An important thing with a regional major power is it's still struggling. It still's got to contend with the fact that all the other major powers are going to pounce on top of it and kill the shit out of it should they ever misstep, become weak, whatever. Look what happened to so many other nations like Spain, the amount of times people tried to dogpile on Britain, China to sort of a lesser degree, a lot of the Levant nations. Anyway, when you get to something like called a hegemon, or at least a regional hegemon, is when that major power, a regional major power, did a line of cocaine. And now that thing is so powerful that it not only can, dominate its own region, but it's so powerful that it can, it's like the cartoon where it's got one hand on one person and then puts the hand on the other person. It has now become so powerful it can handle its own region and not be worried about being destroyed by its own region and begin influencing other regions, right? And that's a very useful thing to have as a state, because it means, well, I can't die to my own region, but I can also dibble dabble and mess around with other regions, such that those other regions never get strong enough to contest me here at this region. And that is a very powerful thing to have, because it means, your longevity is secured. And then we get to what some people, obviously very debatable, get to what America is, and it's a global hegemon. Everywhere is America's backyard, functionally speaking, more or less, right? There's some areas where America is more powerful, some areas where America is less powerful, but America doesn't need to be worried about, South America invading it. It doesn't need to be worried about Canada invading it, partially because we're allies, partially because that would not be a fair fight for anyone involved. But we're also so powerful that we are influencing multiple regions in the world to our liking, so on and so forth, and you get, hegemon.
So I think that that's a really interesting way to describe it. It's something that, has become popular in my circles as well. They use the term the global American empire, right, to kind of describe that. And I think one of the ways you can see it is in cultural terms, right? American culture is everywhere. Our kind of tastes are reflected the world over. So what are some ways in which, America has sort of established itself as an empire? Say I'm not convinced that America is an empire. How would you convince me?
I mean, starting with what you just said, the realist won't like this nearly as much, but America's winning, or has won the not culture war per se, right? Because that term means something nowadays. But like you said, American culture has become most of the world's culture. Now you might say, Japan's Japan, Britain's Britain, but we've influenced them in such a way that it's not even considered anymore. So on that vein alone, America is already dominant, right? But then you can get, to keep it in a realist vein, you can get in kind of a military perspective of America being dominant. Now, I think people are going to keep looking for the situations where America is not dominant, and there's always small little itty bitty bits that you can find anywhere. But you can play a game of GeoGuessr and just put a pin on a random point on a map, and chances are you're within missile range of an American base, or you're within striking distance of an aircraft carrier strike group within 24 hours. Right? From that perspective, from the hard power perspective, America is there, and you can kind of meld those two together, soft power and hard power, to get just really something that we haven't seen ever in human history, right? Like we talk about the amount of times the Gulf of Hormuz has been, under attack by regional powers in the area, which always are going to have a home field advantage. And then a couple days later, America shows up, and that's not a problem anymore. But the soft power aspects combined with that military power, a country just gets the worst earthquake in human history, and America's able to show up with a force to kind of provide humanitarian aid on a level that's never been seen before, right? No one else has that level of funding, willpower, and ability to just drop like something like war's amount of funding per day just on a whim out of goodwill. So there's so many aspects. It's hard to actually answer that question in a lot of ways because it's so self-evident that it becomes hard to describe.
Well, and there's a infographic. It's gone around the internet for a long time, and it's a map of the world. It's a heat map, right? And it shows the distribution of Roman currency, right? So obviously it's around the Mediterranean, everywhere in the empire. But as far away as, China, India, kind of like the west coast of Africa, east coast, west coast, I get it mixed up, the other side of Africa. And what's interesting in that is you see also the commercial aspect, right? That you're 100% right about the soft power that is culture. The hard power, I feel like, is incontrovertible, right? It's like, who else has 12 aircraft carriers? But I think that there's something too as well, which is like, until relatively recently, the American dollar was accepted everywhere, with notable exceptions. And I think that, being that kind of like, that the economic powerhouse, the cultural powerhouse, and the military powerhouse. I mean, okay, maybe you don't like the term hegemon, but it's pretty hard to argue that America is the biggest dog or the biggest kid on the playground.
Yeah. I think it's important not to get emotionally invested in some of these terms, because I think people view this like good guy, bad guy, or, like a narrative in a novel. When you say American, drinking some soda, so getting some burps. When you say America is a world hegemon, I mean, that's kind of more of an objective fact. It's not like I'm rooting for them or I'm not rooting for them, though, I obviously have my own personal preferences. Or when you say American culture is universal, that might be a good thing, that might be a bad thing, but an important thing with political science and any science, some scientists might be upset that I just called political science an actual science, but it's important to view it, objectively from a third party perspective, because there's data to be gained there, right?
And this is why I've started this off with this idea of, we're dealing with what is, not what we believe ought to be. You and I are not saying here, and we're sitting here like, yes, America should rule every inch of this planet. And actually, I got into this with some more, shall we say, some more baby boomers. I wrote a piece for The Blaze, and I mentioned this idea of America as an empire. And I was treated to those kind of emotional responses, like, no, America's not an empire, we're a republic. And I'm like, okay, that's not what I meant. It's not what I meant. And I think that it's glad that you brought that up to kind of take this away from the emotional framing. This does not mean empire in the Star Wars sense, right?
Yeah. American empire is very different from historical empires. Like there is American land isn't like physically ruled over land isn't significantly larger than it's ever been, and in fact, it's gotten smaller in a lot of ways. But it's something we haven't really seen before. It's the conjunction of American just extreme military might combined with an economic system that we make very strong strides to keep operational, good or bad, combined with the American soft, cultural reach that is also just as like a side effect kind of spread out everywhere. Is it literally an empire? No, it's not an empire. America doesn't literally rule the world. No one thinks America literally rules the world, but it's the closest we've ever, been to something like this. So empire is used because the English language is imprecise and it gets the point across.
So what does the term rules-based international order mean, and how is it relevant to this conversation?
That's a very long topic, so I'll try to keep it very dense and concise. And in order to understand what rules in international relations, you kind of have to approach it from a philosophical point of view of before major powers exist, or before hegemonic and regional powers existed, in that there technically are no rules, right? You wind the clock back far enough, and I'm not talking like Stone Ages or something like that, though actually technically would apply then too.
But nobody's dragging Hannibal before the Hague, right?
Yeah. There's no systems, there's no rules back then, and I think most people might be thinking about the UN, but it's even simpler than that, right? Like if let's just pick a generic country, right? If Japan invades Korea in the 1600s, 1500s, whatever, not that they did, but if country A invades country B, what's the ramification? There are no ramifications other than country C being like, "Ooh, it's my time to strike." But that's not rules, right? That's just opportunistic stuff. So there really aren't any rules in the international system because there's no one to enforce the rules, and all that really happens is action and then reaction and then action, reaction, action, reaction. So for a lot of human history, we kind of use this phrase that international politics or geopolitics is a thing or system of anarchy. Not in the sense that everyone's going around Mad Max style, but in the sense that there is no system in place to punish bad behavior other than if a country wants to do that, but then there's probably likely other reasons. So that gets us to the rules in the international system. How do you have rules in the international system? Well, for a while there really was no way other than countries coming together and agreeing to certain things, right? How warfare should be fought was a big one. But fundamentally, at the end of the day, the rule breaker was rewarded, right? If you have a rule about fighting war in a very humane way, and then you come out of the gate and you fight the most brutal war in existence, you have a head start because, wow, you didn't give a shit about those rules and your enemies did, right? There is no higher power to enforce these rules, right? In the same way, you and me as, citizens of a country say what you want about it. There is a monopoly of violence in that country. And if we break the rules as outlined, we get our pee-pee slapped hard with bullets. So that gets us to international relations. What is that higher power? Well, turns out it's America, right? Now, America has done its best efforts to kind of codify these rules in something that's a little more fair and a little less, authoritarian. And we have stuff like the Bretton Woods institutions. We have, the UN as a whole, where a lot of, countries come together and agree upon what those rules might be. But at the end of the day, the jokes about the UN are based on some degree of fact. It is ultimately backed up by the United States and her allies, and mostly just the United States, of like, hey, if you do something bad, we're going to punish you. And we see that, right? You do something bad, sanctions. You do something bad, sanctions. You do something bad, oh my God, that country just got more funding than the last 40 years of American funding combined, right? Like, that's what it looks like. That's what rules in the international scene look like.
Well, I think one of the things that is, and this is perhaps a question we will get to later, but the questions I wonder is, does that, because I think that you're right that order, that rules-based order is basically America and friends, right? Yeah. Does that order outlast the American empire? Which I realize is opening up a whole can of worms we can maybe get into later, but I do think that's an interesting question. Like, have we managed to create something longer lasting than ourselves?
Depends on who you ask, right? It depends on who you ask. Like, some people will argue that the Western ideology, the Western way of life, the Western way of thinking, secular thinking, all that stuff, has surpassed America. And if America got Thanos snapped out of existence, the other countries in the world would keep that going. And there's certainly some strong argumentation for that. I think that the strongest version of that has been like democratic peace theory, right? Democratic nations don't fight other democratic nations because the people get pissed off when you do that, because they're so interconnected. And then there's arguments, that globalization, the utter extreme, at like the granular level, wow, I can't talk, interconnection of the economies of different countries has made it so war that we've seen in the past could never happen again. And that globalization is kind of an American ideal. So even without America, globalization has the potential to persist and prevent, a return to, a pre-America war, not literally pre-America, but pre-global hegemon America. So there's a lot of argumentation that, America isn't required into this anymore because America is, everyone's got a little American in them. It sounds kind of stupid, but yeah, like people agree, have most of the world has come to agree on this system being valid. So it doesn't need America to kind of perpetuate it. But then there's the more realist perspective of, no, this is as cool as this is. The only reason this is going on is because there's a guy with a really big stick running around. And every time you break the rules in her eyes, you get hit with the stick. And that's what's keeping everything going. So yeah, it depends on who you ask on if it's going to outlast America or not.
Well, Brock, I think all you need to do is take a look at my profile picture, and you can probably get my general outlook on the world.
Yeah. Most realists are of the opinion that maybe not complete collapse of the system, but a return to like a multipolar world of sort, which probably is going to have a lot of similarities with the world we live in, but also not, right? Certain systems are propped up by America.
It seems to be that the chat has fundamentally misunderstood. You were naming two sides of an argument, not saying two things in complete contradiction that you believe. So we're witnessing the death of nuance in real time in the chat.
Yeah. The first thing I talked about is generally considered a liberal point of view, and not liberal in the sense of American liberalism, right? Not that liberalism, but like geopolitical liberalism, which is very ideas based and as I described, right? That's political science liberalism. They believe it's kind of surpassed the state in some ways. And then what the version 2, where the system can't keep going because the thing that's keeping the system going is going to die, right? America, or potentially will die. And that's kind of the more realist point of view.
So why do you think that first world countries, particularly, countries involved in NATO are, and obviously this trend, I guess, is kind of reversed in the last 2 years due to a prominent real world happening, but have historically spent very little on their own defense.
Yeah. I mean, it's what's the simplest way to put it? I mean, why would they, right? Militaries are comically expensive. It's one of the most expensive. Historically, it's one of the most expensive things. 5% of GDP, 10% of GDP. And then the reality is you kind of need to train with that military. Militaries are very expensive. And then the hilarious thing about militaries is they kind of just atrophy, right? If you don't keep investing into your military with R&D, training, and more, you're going to have a really crappy military. Look to current events for that one, right? The military is a consistent investment. And if you don't use that military, retroactively, you look back at it and you're like, wow, those last 30 years of military expending were pointless, right? That could have been spent towards charging my economy. That could have been spent on humanitarian stuff. That could have been spent on, progressive things, right? Like less taxes, medical, whatever, right? But historically, you have to have a military. That was non-negotiable. But what if you exist in a system where, there's a couple half dozen bases in Germany with the biggest military of all time, like in that base? Why bother building a military? Your military, like the full deployment strength of Denmark, Sweden, it's almost nothing by comparison if this military shows up. So these countries are very much incentivized not to do that because, frankly, why would they? Right? They're not going to be the linchpin in the defense of the nation. Now, I'm not saying they don't have a military, but they're not going as hard as they would if all the European nations were responsible solely for their own survival.
Well, and I think also if they were at all worried that other European nations would sort of come knocking, right? Like the idea that, I don't know, Denmark would invade Sweden in current year, it's almost laughable to say it, right? No one's actually concerned about that anymore.
Yeah, the more interesting version of that is, Germany versus France versus, England, right? These were the countries that have been.
That ever happened before?
I don't think so. It's purely hypothetical. But these countries have historically been not the bestest of homies, and we would think they would be militarizing against each other, but fundamentally they've all been kind of put on the same page, at least in the short term, right? Or not short term. It's been decently long, but. At this time, they're all homies. They're not afraid of them attacking each other. And there's also that collective aspect. Even if there was in America, NATO/EU is a very large conglomerate of military power. Someone would have to be really stupid to attack it at this time.
So we've sort of obliquely referenced the idea that the U.S. empire kind of could or is in the process of losing its status as a global hegemon. Do you see this as something that's happening? Do you see this as sort of an inevitable occurrence in any empire? Or do you think that America is just going to kind of keep sailing as, the ruler of the world?
You got to kind of approach this from 2 points of view. I think historically, looking back, we'll know the answer. But right now, we don't really know the answer. So we kind of have to, we can kind of throw some stuff at the wall and kind of, guess to that effect. From the perspective, like perception based, America is absolutely losing ground big time, right? You mentioned Europe not spending anything. They're starting to spend stuff now, right? They're starting to build up their militaries, and that in small part, it's not all of it, but a small part of that is loss of trust that America is going to send, 10 plus divisions over the ocean. If something bad happens in Europe to the point where that's needed, right? Some of that is based on the fear that America won't be there. Look at Japan. Japan is very, very happy to not have a military, right? It's been very useful for them to have a micro military relative to their economy size, especially now, right? Japan's not doing so hot economically, over the last 30 years or so. So, they'd love to not have the military, but what are we observing? We're observing the exact opposite. When I was over there, I think Shinzo Abe was, doing slowly at first, and then more and more and more pushing towards, remilitarization, pushing towards overturning the part of the Constitution that prevents them, from having a military, creatively reinterpreting the Constitution. Why would they go through all this effort if, America's going to be there to save them? Well, some of it is hedging, right? They're like, well, we're not 100% sure if America's going to be there. Now, it's worth noting, none of these militaries are at like 10% GDP growth rate at this time. So I would argue most of them still think America's going to be there, but you don't go all in on a single thing. So perception wise, and then of course you go look at how America's perceived in the world. We're perceived like shit, relatively speaking. So even on a ground level, America's influence and strength and whatever you want to call it is being perceived as way less than it's ever been. Maybe even though we have a shitload of military victories under our belt. So from the perception point of view, yeah, we're losing ground big time, right? And then, okay, not to get into that, but very lightly touching on it, there are other countries in the world that are gaining ground. And at least from my perspective, I view this whole thing as a zero-sum game. If country A gains ground, it means country B has to lose ground. And we're seeing a couple countries in the world really gaining some ground, at least perception-wise, once again.
Well,
now, the harder question... Oh, sorry, go ahead.
No, I'm glad you brought up that point, zero-sum game. It was on the tip of my tongue, but sorry, back to you. I want you to finish that thought.
Yeah. Then the much harder question, because it actually, means putting your foot down, is America actually losing not physical, but is it losing ground as its ability to be the world hegemon? Now, that's a really tough question to answer. On one hand, no, we're still turbo powerful, right? Like we could wipe the floor with any nation in the world. In fact, the current war that's going on illustrates that, right? Like everyone thought Russia was something that could take on all of Europe. Turns out, probably not, right? But the flip side is we know America is still very capable in, direct warfare. They're like a lot of people that don't study the Iraq war from a military history standpoint don't really understand this, but it was both of them, the Gulf and the Iraqi freedom, were just landslide victories by proportions that can't just be explained by we got bigger, better planes, right? It wasn't just that, right? And these wars have completely overturned how modern countries fight wars. The answer in the past was always mass was the quality, right? You need mass. And these wars completely flipped that on its head. And it's like, it's not about mass anymore. And it turns out America is functionally the only country in the world that has that ability to fight this new modern style of war under its belt. Now, there's tons of argumentations of, Iraq was shit, blah, 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 blah. But I think we've seen even winning in an overmatched scenario is much harder than you'd imagine. So from that perspective, no, America's doing swell. We're doing quite great. But then you look at the zero-sum game perspective, and it does seem like we're weaker, right? There are other countries that are getting stronger. Our economy's not doing as hot as it, used to. We're still winning, but we're not winning as fast as we used to be winning. And that gap seems to be closing. So I don't think anyone's going to be like, America is not a hegemon anymore, but it's starting to seem likely that we probably won't make it. Definitely not to the end of the century, but what about, to the halfway century point? Hard to say, but it's not looking great, right? There's no real answer here, right? Like I would be making a lot of money as a political scientist if I could come up with a really good answer here, right? But no one really knows.
Well, there's an idea in economics, right, that the amount doesn't matter. It's all about your trends. That really it's the direction the lines are going that matters more than any one data point. And I think that, your view of it as a zero-sum game is astute. And again, I just want to reiterate this for the umpteenth time, that I'm not saying that out of some kind of deep-seated hatred of America. I'm not sitting here saying oh, I can't wait till there are tanks rolling down, a Washington Avenue or something. But I think it's important to temper this all with the realization that America is a country, and there's no one country that wins forever, right? Eventually, and who knows, it may be 50 years, it may be 300 years, you're no longer on top. And I think given kind of current trends, that seems to be in the cards at some point in the future. And I think that one of the things that's important about this is that to a certain degree, perception becomes reality, right? There's this dumb idea from 40K, right? There's this race of aliens. And their will put together is so strong that if they believe something, it becomes true, right? If they believe that painting something red makes it go faster, if you get enough of them together, it actually works, right? And that's a stupid example.
Oh,
but again,
wow. Did they put like decals on their cars and then they go
100%. It's literally that. And so what you see again is, the classic example, right, of the prison guard with a gun. And there's 30 prisoners and he's got 10 shots in his gun. And so if they rush him, right, at least some of those guys are going to get whacked. But he can't get everyone. And obviously, that's not exactly how international relations goes. It's not like, someone says, I don't want to use the dollar anymore, and we just nuke them, At least I don't think that's how it works. But nonetheless, there is this kind of, as you set up incentives, right, to leave the US system, people react to that. And I think that's what you've seen with the kind of, and obviously BRICS has not been quite what it is cracked up to be. But nonetheless, the idea that BRICS is being floated and seriously considered tells us, I think, how world leaders are feeling, if you see what I'm saying.
Yeah. It's almost, at least how I view BRICS, it's more of just like hey, this is a thing, right? We're pushing back on the soft power front. It's like, what's up, right? America, like, please let us have more at the dinner table. Not in that tone. But, countries do this all the time. They posture back and forth. I don't think, at least personally, not yet. I don't really think BRICS is a serious thing per se.
So this was a really interesting discussion. Thank you for sort of outlining, your system of thought here. But I want to bring this back to kind of your bread and butter, right? Which is preparedness, the 2A stuff. How do you view, what you've just said? How does that affect your kind of preparation for disaster, your beliefs about, that sort of thing? Are they related?
Yeah, to a degree. Maybe I'm going to go slightly off tangent here since I'm reading some of the comments, but I think it's an important, it's like reading the news, but like a more expanded version of that. Like me viewing geopolitics is distinctly in a lot of ways detached from my day-to-day life, right? Like, I might be before America, being a world hegemon. I might not be for America being a global hegemon. But I think it's fundamentally important to understand, what that means and implications of certain things, because you can kind of understand why certain things are happening in the world. And a big reason why I made that video on a channel that has nothing to do with geopolitics is I think it's important to understand vectors for change in our life. Right. And in our lifetime, big change, right? Not just little itty bitty change, but big change. This has the potential to be one of the American retrenchment, whether you like it or not, completely irrelevant, does not matter. It will change your way of life massively. So it's important to understand what the why it exists the way it does nowadays and what some vectors might be for that to occur. And if you can recognize those themes, well, you are in a much better position than 99% of Americans to recognize situations well before they happen, right? Some people might see Japan completely removing the limitations on their constitution and really gearing up, or we might see some American bases being removed from certain parts of the world. Most people are going to be like, yeah, about time. And maybe it is about time. But if you're informed on the subject, that's a huge red flag for, oh my gosh, the people in power are consciously thinking about retrenchment. And at some point, that may click. That may just completely click over world perception-wise. And in a very short time frame, we can see a vastly different change to our day-to-day life. And I think it's important to, at minimum, be mentally prepared for that, right? That's an important thing to do in life. Even if you don't do any physical preparing, being mentally prepared for things helps you not be blindsided and to default into normalcy bias. So that's kind of how I view at least geopolitics. It's also fun to talk about, right?
No,
50% of this stuff is going to be wrong, but
it goes back to that point about the best mental model is 60% right. It's like you'd hope to be at least close to the top of that. Well, I think about it with the COVID stuff, because regardless of your opinions on COVID particularly, it did really change things. And, as kind of a news junkie, I was watching, in I think it would have been like the year before it hit, like 2019, the end of that year, December, right?
Yeah.
Watching the videos that I think all of us saw out of China.
Well, it's not everyone, interestingly, but yeah, like some people didn't. So they have very different perspectives on COVID than I think, from what I'm guessing here, you or I had the perspective of COVID, right?
Well, definitely. And so at least for those first couple months, like before anyone else was noticing, it was kind of this soft, like, wait a minute, like, is this it? There's this thing happening in China that no one's talking about. And that means that when it finally came around, when everyone else is losing their mind, you're like, okay, well, I mean, this is probably bad, but at least I'm emotionally prepared for the end of the world, which is certainly something.
I mean, that's a really interesting thing you brought up. It's not geopolitics, but for those that were actively watching world events, COVID started for us in about November, December, roughly speaking, of that time frame. And you're watching the cases out of China, and it looks, everyone's gonna be like, yeah, COVID's a cough, whatever. Shut up. Back then, we didn't have good information.
We knew nothing.
We knew nothing. All we knew was that China was getting bent over raw because they were ill-equipped to handle this stuff, and their solution was welding people into buildings. So, when people are being welded into buildings, like, that's what the, like, everyone.
You look at that and you're like, well, logically, that has to be really bad. I wouldn't do that unless it was literally like the Rainbow Six virus.
Yeah, it looked terrifying. And I'm like, oh God. And then, within circles, we're talking about, like, how do we deal with this thing? It's respiratory in nature. I'm talking to some doctors, like, this is how you can handle with over the shelf stuff. This is how you build a clean room. Like, I bought some of these things, and then, oh God, January came around, and that little COVID tracker that was on, like, I think John Hopkins or whatever with ArcGIS, 1 dot in America, 2 dots in America. And it's like, it's over, right? It's here. Now, turned out, okay, didn't end up being that big of a deal. But, relatively speaking, it's still one of the biggest events in our lifetime. But, not to the degree most people thought. And I think that's an interesting analog, right? Could have add an extra 0 to the mortality rate of this thing, and things could have been vastly different. And no one really knew at the time. And I kind of view it the same way with, looking at geopolitics. It's good to understand this stuff. A good chance it's going to be like COVID, where it's like, okay, psych, I overreacted. But it's good to keep your ear to the ground and understand.
Well, definitely, Brock. We are running out of time. If people want to find more of your work, what's a good way for them to do that?
My name's BrassFacts. You put it into YouTube, and then the dog with the night vision goggles shows up, and you can click on it. Admittedly, though, most of it is not going to be like this conversation. In fact, the vast majority of it is not going to be like this conversation. I focus mostly on, like, gun reviews, gear reviews, and then philosophy of use of how to use something that in a prepared context to a extreme autistic degree. But yeah, if you want to check that stuff out.
Well, definitely. And I highly recommend your stuff. I really have to blame you for an astonishing number of poor financial decisions.
Oh, no.
You made me buy an ACOG, and I will never recover from it. But
I can't wait till you buy an LCAM.
Don't talk to me about it. Anyway, if you guys want to find my stuff, this podcast is available on Apple, Spotify, YouTube, anywhere you listen to podcasts. You can also check out my Substack and my sponsor, Axios Remote Fitness and Coaching. If you're interested in preparing yourself for unfamiliar times, JD, the owner, personal friend of mine, absolute physical specimen, genuinely frightening human being. He's pretty good at it. He can help you get that set up. And again, Brox, thank you so much for your time.
Thanks for having me.
And everyone at home, remember, keep your head up. The light can't last forever. Good night. All right, FocusTripp. Welcome to the Jay Burden Show. How you doing, man?
I'm doing great. Thanks for having me on, sir.
Yeah, I'm glad to have you on. This is my roughly quarterly adventure into Guntube. So obviously, I know what you do. I'm a fan of your work, but some of my audience might not be familiar with you. So who are you, and what do you do on the internet?
Yeah, well, I appreciate it, man. FocusTripp. I run the FocusTripp YouTube channel. I'm also a contributor on the Gun.Deals channel. I also own Focus Shooting LLC. Most of what I focus on is gun content reviews. Recently, been doing some semi-controversial live streams as well. Yeah, I basically make content that interests me in the gun space, if you will.
Yeah, so I've followed your work for a while, and really what I find valuable in it is that you take a very different attitude towards product review than, shall we say, a lot of your compatriots. So I'm curious, right? Could you tell me how you approach reviewing a product and maybe contrast that to what's more popular.
Yeah. So if you watch my channel like 5 years ago, maybe even 6 or 7 years ago at this point, the old content's really bad, really crappy content. Didn't exactly know what I was doing. I was just having fun with guns and basically posting it online, which is fine for, like very low tier content. But as I got better, as I kind of knew what I liked more and liked less, and developed higher standards for actually reviewing product and, understanding what I liked about a product, didn't like about a product, and what I thought was a waste of money, my emphasis changed from essentially shooting something and talking about it to very critically looking at a product, what it does well, what it does poorly, and does this actually provide benefit to the end user? Now, a lot of my compatriots in the 2A space online, or at least the gun review space, let's say, they focus mostly on selling product. They emphasize the pros of a product, what it does well. Very rarely is there an analytical look at what something does, especially compared to other products that may or may not be better. And we'll get into this later, I'm sure, about the consumerism side on it and how it's all designed to push more and more product. Whereas most of these people rely on companies to get more product, to keep the reviews coming. A lot of them get early access to product. I try to not stand with companies, but stand in between companies and the end user. Because I don't believe that these companies, just for the mere fact that they exist and produce a product, deserve access to my viewers' wallets, right? Where a lot of my fellow Guntubers appear to be happy to sell out their audience for a couple bucks.
Yeah, it's an interesting thing you bring up there, because, and I feel like this is something that you gain with enough experience, right? You've been around the block a few times, and you start to notice this kind of like cyclical pattern, right? Which is new product comes out, and even actually in many cases before it's released to the public, there's this kind of like interior ring of media figures who get access to it right before anyone else. They drop a review the day that it becomes available to the public. They all say it's amazing, and it is the hot thing, right? You need to get it. And if you don't, you're gay and lame, and everyone's going to make fun of you. And then 2 months pass, and everyone's forgotten about that old thing, and the cycle continues. And so you see that happen enough times, and you start to look around, and you're like, wait a minute, what's going on here? And so maybe could you speak to the way that companies tend to interact with kind of firearms influencers?
Oh, 100%. So the cyclical nature of this goes way deeper than just new product, get excited for new product, forget about that product, we're on to the next thing. If you look at it, there's waves of different styles of products like red dots, LPVOs, magnifiers, prisms, lever guns, revolvers are hot again for some reason, all sorts of different cycles. But you see the same faces repeated over and over and over again because these actors are reliable for the companies. They have the appearance of being unbiased some of the time. They have the appearance of being objective, right? But at the end of the day, the reason why they are still on these companies' short lists of influencers is because they're reliable money generators, right? For example, a few times when I was accepting products for review, I would have something negative and then I would post a video about it. I would get an angry email and then it would be like, okay, well, hey, we can't send you any more product if you're going to act like this. And it's like, are you threatening me? It's like, I guess I don't want product from you at this point. So a lot of the times you see the same faces because they make reliably high quality videos with generic talking points. They'll say it's great and amazing. And then 2 months later, new product comes out and then they're saying the exact same things about that product. And it's like, well, hey, what about that thing you just reviewed? And they're like, what? What do you mean? It's almost like there's a short-term memory that a lot of these people have. And you'll see it. There's more of a awareness of it at this point since people like me and others have been calling it out. And I mean, people like Nut and Fancy, if you look back, he's been calling it out for a decade now, which is why he's been ostracized from the larger gun community, if you will. But people who get review guns who are on shortlists tend to behave in a specific way towards these companies. And you'll even hear rhetoric like this on podcasts where people say, hey, if you ever have an issue with your product, you got to take it to the company first and give them a chance to fix it before you go public with an issue. And my approach is the opposite of that. If there's an issue with a product, you need to inform potential buyers of that like right away, because people are going to be buying that in the interim. And I don't believe that companies have a lot of them anyways, don't have a great financial incentive to actually fix issues. It's much cheaper. It's much faster just to throw an issue under the bridge and then move on to your next big thing, right?
Well, and it's especially interesting because you've seen that kind of like, shall we say, like shoddy consumer practices go much farther up the chain than you would expect, right? Like, I hate to say it, but if you buy a low end product for the bottom of the barrel price, you kind of assume that, right? It's not great, but I bought a $70 Amazon Red Dot for my TX22 because it's a 22. And if it breaks, I kind of know what I'm getting, right? It's a Chinese company that probably doesn't exist a week after I buy it. But when you see that to companies that, not only charge a premium for their product, but also, go around to governments and say, hey, look at my new whiz bang product. It's the best ever. And take that same attitude to it. It's revealing. I'll put it that way.
Yeah, 100%. I mean, if we want to talk about companies that get government contracts without somehow putting out a decent product, I mean, like SIG.
I was about to say, you could figure who I was talking about.
Yeah, it's just ridiculous. It's like, okay, so you got, hundreds of millions, or I don't even know if the contracts are up to $1 billion yet, but just so much money for these different products. Surely it's not killing people in the, by accident, not intentionally killing people. It's injuring their own users, right? I think actually, talking about SIG, I think yesterday or today, they lost a lawsuit against somebody for $11 million for it going off in somebody's holster again. So, I mean, there's litigation to back this stuff up that these companies, and what's funny is too, like 10 plus years ago when the 320 was coming out, you had the same wave of positive reviews, everybody loving it, everybody saying it was the best thing ever. And then, you hear reports trickle out here and there. And then 10 years later, everybody's like, actually, it was a terrible gun all along. Bad design from the start.
So I'll put in a little bit of backstory on this because, while you and I are incorrigible gun autists, my audience is not, at least primarily. Basically, what happened is Sig Sauer, not the German one, an American company, with a similar name, released this new gun, right? It's going to be the best thing ever. It had some admittedly innovative features that, we won't need to get into, but very, very quickly upon coming out to the market, it revealed a charming new quirk where it would just go off in a holster, which is, and FocusTripp, you could back me up on this, suboptimal for a gun. And okay, fair enough. A new product comes to market. That's, and it's bad. That happens quite often. But what was really suspicious is despite it being bad, and not just bad as in sometimes it would go off, but even if you have a perfectly working version of this gun, it's not very good. Like, it's fine, but it's certainly not worth the downside. All of a sudden, magically, different nations, different, police organizations all started adopting it. Including, right, the U.S. military. And, there are people who go deep into the specifics of this. But it seems extremely likely that Sig Sauer basically paid off people so that they would be selected because they did not meet any of the criteria by which the relevant guns were selected. And so obviously, scummy companies are scummy companies. But my point is, right, these products are not, or these problems, right, with consumer practices are not just limited to the kind of like bottom of the barrel, like fly by night companies. It's kind of endemic.
Somehow, the more government contracts you have, the less you care about quality control. Now, talking about SIG and their government contracts, there's Occam's razor, right? Everybody knows what that is. But I have another concept called Occam's retard, and that is what the government operates on when picking out handguns or rifles or anything. Whatever the most retarded decision could be, that's the one that they're going to make. So going with the 320 was absolutely a combination of bribery and backdoor shenanigans. And you ended up with a subpar handgun that people have been trying to get away from now. So yeah, that whole situation is just a absolute mess.
So yeah, I also want to return to the reviewer side of it, right? Because look, I was a little bit young for Gamergate. Wasn't really on the internet then, but I sort of became aware of it in college. I've told this story; my audience has heard it, so many times they're rolling their eyes. But I went to college and took a class called game theory, which I naively assumed was like economic game theory, right? Prisoner's Dilemma and all that. It turns out that it was the critical theory of video games, which means I just got an entire crash course from a 300-pound feminist about Gamergate and got to pay for it. And so point is, right, the reason I bring that up is to say that was an industry where you saw a similar problem, right? Where there were journalists who were being paid to deliver unbiased information, who had a financial, shall we say, a financial stake, right? In, companies or products. And so I'm curious, right? You mentioned earlier that people are more aware of it. I mean, do you think that there is sort of a Gamergate-esque situation in the firearms community?
It will never be to the same level because game journalists are the lowest of the low, right? So in the tiers of journalists, right, they're all peons, but game journalists are like shoot on sight, right? The worst of the worst. If you're a game journalist, I'm sorry that you exist for the most part. In the firearms community, you actually do have some standards. So, for instance, recently TFB TV was doing a video on the new Magpul / Zev folding pistol thingamajig, right? The entire comment section is calling them out for how poor of a fluff piece video. Like, it's obvious it's just the most biased, ridiculous puff piece ever imagined. Like, it was painful to watch. And so this sort of thing is very noticed in the gun community, I think partially because it's a more storied industry. It has more prestige, if you will. It has a lot of history there. A lot of the writers there, a lot of the companies do hold themselves to slightly higher standards. So I don't think you're ever going to get a Gamergate type situation where, you suddenly find out that people are getting paid to do certain things and whatnot. That's kind of an open secret. But even a company like TFB TV that doesn't accept money, that is very clear in their literature and behind the scenes and whatnot, they do accept early access and flights. And so monetary incentive isn't just money. There's a lot more to it. It's access. It's all this other stuff that you lose when you go against the grain.
Yeah, and that's an interesting thing to talk about, right? That oftentimes the quid pro quo isn't even like a bag of cash with a dollar sign written on it. It is exactly what you said. It's the combination of, because of the way the internet works, right? You were incentivized to be the first out with something. And if you lose out and all of a sudden you're trailing 2 weeks behind, you've lost the algorithm. And so it seems like from the outside looking in, companies can kind of use that and hold that over your head.
100%. So a lot of guys that are new to the firearms industry, specifically content creation, I get these messages all the time of how do I get access? How do I start? How do I do this? And it really sucks to tell them that you kind of don't want it. Because nowadays, if you watch a day one gun review, you're going to notice the like to dislike ratio is way worse. The comment section is full of like shill, right? And then people like, hey, I'll wait for the BrassFacts review, or I'll wait for this review, because they know that, yeah, it's going to be 2 weeks late, a month late, but they know that they're going to get actual like good information, right? Versus these corporate puff pieces, which is why I think for all of the gun industry's many faults, it is in a much better space than a lot of these other industries. And it's because, for whatever reason, again, the gun people, myself included, are more apt to call these people out, right? Something that I used to be a part of is more car-centric stuff and computer-centric stuff as well. The computer space is actually also really good about calling out companies for different poor behavior. For instance, MSI was essentially bribing people or holding things above people's heads for negative reviews. So that is something that other industries also do well, and the gun industry is not the worst at. But it is something that definitely still is there and that people need to be aware of. But by and large, if you're kind of autistic about it, like we are, like you're going to notice it. You're going to know who the players are, who's going to put out the day one reviews, who's going to get early access and fight to keep that access. Because I'll be honest, a lot of these guys are only relevant because they have a day one review that some normie is going to click on, right? So even if nobody watches the rest of their content, if they get a video out early enough, they'll get a couple 100,000 views off of that. And that's what they sustain for the, 4 or 5 major product launches in a year.
Yeah, it's an interesting point. One of the things that I have noticed, and this is especially apparent since COVID, is the impact that social media has had on gun culture, right? Because as someone who grew up in this, and don't get me wrong, there are pros and cons to this, it's gotten way, way bigger, right? And the emergence of, I don't know what you would call it, but like hype culture, drop culture, which I don't understand. I deleted my Instagram in 2020, so I don't get it. Right? I feel like an old man. But that's a very new, relatively speaking, development. Because when I grew up, right, gun culture was, some crazy baby boomer at a gun show sitting out in the parking lot, passing out, something that is either definitely or at least possibly going to get you on a government watch list, or ranting about Waco. And it was insane. It was fun, right? But it was a very niche thing. And so I'm curious, right? What have you seen, in your time in this kind of part of culture? How is social media affecting it?
Yeah, no, social media absolutely is responsible for a lot of the good and bad growth in the gun industry. So my family was never super into guns. My dad was in the military. I have a couple brothers in the military, but we never owned a lot of guns or went shooting all of the time. I really only ever went a couple times before I was 18 with my brother or something like that. But popular media, I think Modern Warfare 1 and 2, and of course subsequent games as well, were huge for that sort of things. Because ever since 2009 and whenever Modern Warfare 2 came out, the ACR has been my favorite rifle. Then 15 years later, hey, I've owned 4 of them. Not a great gun, but I've owned 4.
Okay. You can't make fun of me for having an L-can if you have had 4 ACRs. We have both made horrible emotional decisions.
I acknowledge that the ACR is bad, though.
I'm still
love it. It's
I'm still deep in the closet. I have not admitted it yet.
Yes, that's the thing. You can. There is that culture, right? About you see something in a video game, and then you click on a Grantham video that shows off. I think he just did a video a couple weeks ago on the whatever the new, is it Black Ops 6 or something? That's a crazy thing to say, isn't it? Black Ops 6. Anyway, so you see something in popular media, and then kids now, they have access to all of this information and all of this high quality content, at least in terms of looks. So if somebody wants to see, hey, I remember PUBG was big for this too, because there was PUBG videos of something bouncing off of a frying pan, and then that video would have 15 million views or something, right? Somebody basically recreating something in real life that you would see in a video game. So I think social media absolutely has brought guns to a younger generation, because I do remember what you're saying about a gun show was essentially the average age might be 70 years old on the inside of a gun show, right? And now if you walk into your local gun store in a, at least mildly populated area, maybe that's come all the way down to 35 as the average age, You still got your boomers, of course, but man, I know a lot of 18 to 25-year-olds who are getting into guns, and my audience, I think 40% is under 25 or 25 and under. So it is a huge demographic for young people, which is fantastic. That's great. They're coming into this space. They want to be part of it. the downside is that they're young people, right? You know, I'm only 29 years old, so I don't look down on people, but you know that this type of culture, the hype culture, you know, oh gosh, I got this in Flecktarn camo, right? Or like Noveski, and like they're having like naked models for gun launchers, something like that. And it's like, okay, that's like marketing from like 1994, you know, on like a beer calendar or something like that. But you have this weird amalgamation of hyper young people who love the hype beast culture. They like the drops, limited run. You got to buy now. I have buddies who are in the shoe thing, and that's what shoe culture is about. It's all about limited run drops, getting that colorway that only comes around like once a decade or something like that, and then you resell it, right? And so I think it's a good thing, right? Because you're getting a lot of people into the industry, but at the same time, with those people coming in, it's also, they're not hyper mature. You know, they're hype beasts, but not hyper mature. And so they are very consumery, and they're also very low effort. So it's not like us necessarily. I don't want to speak for you, but like, I'm like, hey, the Second Amendment, very important. The original intention of it, you know, that needs to be protected. That needs to be propagated. And then a lot of these new guys are basically like, I don't know, man, guns are cool, you know, and that's as far as it goes for them, right?
Yeah, I definitely see that. I mean, in the YouTube space as well, right? It's pretty easy to see the kind of different tiers of this, right? Where it's like, there's the kind of like very surface level. And look, this stuff is really important. You know, it gets people interested in it. That's like, I'm going to shoot X with Y. You know, like substitute, it's like Mad Libs, right? Substitute your favorite, you know, object and combination of kinetic forces, right? And that's pretty much it. And that's like, there's not a lot of information to be had. You know, it's entertaining, right? It's popcorn, whatever. I don't begrudge it to anyone. And as you get kind of like further and further in until you've reached the stage where you're like, well, if this channel has more than 5,000 subscribers and I can actually hear the guy talking over the massive fan in this machine shop, not interested, you know, which is obviously like, okay, you've probably over rarefied your tastes. But I think it's a more healthy spot because, you know, one of the things I really remember in the kind of like mid 2000s was just how hard it was to get any sort of information whatsoever. And so I remember like being at my grandpa's house, like thumbing through like Soldier of Fortune magazine from before I was born, and like, I don't know, like Guns and Ammo. It'd be like, well, guess the best gun there is a Kimber 45, and I'm 8 years old, you know, where it's like, you just don't have reputable information.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And that's definitely changed. And like you said, I think it's important for all of those facets to be in place, right? Because you almost have the normie to like prepared citizen pipeline, if you will, right? So there's the super low level propaganda that might not even be like strictly pro 2A propaganda or pro gun propaganda, being, you know, like movies and video games, TV shows and whatnot, that might tangentially get a few percentage points of people interested in guns. And then you have your normie slop content, right? Which is like, hey, are these boobies, these fake boobies, what it was like, will a 22 go through these? Basically, like you said, right? Will X penetrate Y, or whatever it happens to be. You have the more high level, which is like a little bit more entertaining, a little more information focused. And then like the next step up is like the hyper, like, okay, we're starting a militia, we're prepared citizens, and we're doing that, right? And as long as there's a pipeline there to get people into like the more pro 2A side of it, I in general am fine with the entertainment style content, but I also don't want that to just be the only thing and that's where people stop, right?
Well, my favorite dark pastime is so YouTube Shorts, abomination. I'm mad that it exists. However, have you ever been down the rabbit hole of ghetto YouTube Shorts? Specifically as regards firearms?
It's the worst. I know I could do this, and it's only one step above actual ghetto YouTube content. But there's enough of it there where you could make a React style video once a week.
Oh, 100%. And
it would be very entertaining. It would get a lot of views, and it's essentially like I don't think I can say this, but it's like going to the zoo.
Yeah, it's like David Attenborough. Like, I'm on a safari.
Yeah, you look inside, you laugh, and then you leave. But in this case, you're the tour guide, right? So you're just bringing your audience through this zoo. Everybody points and laughs, and then you come back next week, right? That content, that's like, it's still low level content, but that would be so easy to monetize, right? Because it's so painful. You watch this. I know there was the one clip floating around where the guy like shoots his floor with an AR, and then he explains how he's doing it, and then he does it again, and it's like
the exact same spot.
oh,
He like off camera shot his floor in the apartment,
right? And then he
all right.
do it again. So, all right, I show people this. It's amazing content. It truly is one of the things of all time.
One of the other great subgenres is aspiring young astrophysicist shooting off full auto Glocks in residential neighborhoods and then posting it on the internet with their face.
My favorite one is the one where they combine those super cheap tracer rounds, so it looks like a light show is going off, you know?
Yeah, and they just spray it into a lake in the middle of the neighborhood.
I believe this was unintentional, but in one of those shorts that I've seen, the audio comes off and it's like unintelligible. You know, it's talking, it has these subtitles and they're speaking, but the subtitles are just unintelligible. And I don't know if that's or if that is actually just that it doesn't know what they're saying. I don't know if those are AI generated, but I thought it was
YouTube AI.
Exactly. It doesn't know.
No, that's like one of the, and honestly, this is why I met up with another guy who's been on my podcast a couple times, went out, shot guns, had a good time. And we were talking about the absolute horror that is shooting at public ranges, right? I'm lucky enough now to have, multiple pieces of property I can go out and shoot at. It's great. But in the town that I went to college in, right, it was kind of a small rural town, big state school in the middle of it. There was a free shooting range. And it was just chaos, pure chaos at all times, all genres. And the last time I ever went there, it was an engineering school, right? So there was a big Chinese population. And there was this Chinese kid there. First showed up with one of those kind of like gamer 22 rifles that they use for like Olympic sports or whatever. Not that interesting. So I'm shooting, I got my target in front of me. And I hear this just deafening boom. And I look over and this kid has pulled out this like massive nickel plated revolver. And I'm like, well, that's disturbing. And then what I realize is more disturbing is he has not brought a target. He is shooting at my target. And he is 3 to 4 lanes down from me. And the misses start to get closer and closer, right? Like the first one is like low, a foot in front of the target, then like 6 feet in front of the target. And I'm like just watching this triangle shrink. And I was like, all right, I'm done. I'm never coming back. That was the last moment I went to a public range. And I'll put it this way. This is not an atypical story. So I'm curious, right? Do you shoot on private land? Have you had similar horror stories?
So in Washington, where I lived, I was there for 27 years before they basically tried to shut down my business. But there's so much public land in Western Washington and even Eastern Washington when I was going to college there that you can basically kind of find a place within 30 minutes. Like I had Capitol Forest, I had some old rock quarries that I used to shoot at. So they were public spaces, but maybe once every couple months, as somebody who shot all the time, I would run into somebody else, but usually it's not a big deal. Out here in South Dakota, there's no public land, so I have to drive 3 hours to go to the national grasslands in Pierre. And there's one public range about an hour and a half from me that I do go to somewhat often. And in South Dakota, fortunately, especially rural South Dakota, there's almost never anybody there. And it's beautiful lanes, no trash, and it's your own space too, because there's basically berms in between each set. So I think there's a 25 set, a 50 set, and then 2 100-yard lanes where you can essentially, it's like 50 feet wide, 100 feet wide on some of the bigger ones. So you can kind of do whatever you want. So, I mean, I've talked to cops out there because they'll stop you and like, hey, how's it going? They'll just chat with you. And for me, it's like I'm always having SBRs. I have suppressors. I have binaries or FRTs out there. So I do get the odd look every now and again, especially when you're like kitted up, with a camera sitting next to you and people are driving by and they're like, what's this retard doing? And yeah. So, I mean, my interactions out here in South Dakota, very pleasant. But if I were near a big city, I think I would have a very different set of experiences with the clientele of these free ranges. I have heard all the horror stories, so it is quite fun to think about that.
Yeah, see, I had a slightly different problem. I just had like crazy Chinese expats and then like rednecks, which is its own separate variety of an issue. But it's funny you bring that up. I knew you were in the Pacific Northwest just from the geography of it. I went up there for the first time in my entire life a few weeks ago for a conference. And that is a beautiful area of the country ruled by the worst people in the world. Deeply sorry about that. But I understand the appeal. It's genuinely beautiful up there.
No, it is the most beautiful place. Western Washington, White Pass, Snoqualmie, all that stuff. If you ever get the chance to drive that during wintertime, check out, what's that place? Leavenworth, which is like an old German town up there. Absolutely beautiful, but can't stand the people. So absolutely ruins the experience. Like a lot of places. Like, I mean, California is gorgeous, right? Everybody would love to live in California. Great weather, great beaches, can't stand the people.
Yeah, I'm actually, here's my thing with that area. And it's I've only been to Portland, right?
Mm-hmm.
The way people described Portland, I was expecting Mogadishu, right? Like I was expecting it to be unlivable.
Well,
don't get me wrong. I went all over it. Yeah, I went over like the whole city. I was there for a couple days. You didn't have much to do. And don't get me wrong, it's not great. But what tips it over from just being like a dirty, crappy city with a ton of homeless people, which I hate to say it is not a rare thing anymore, is that the Pacific Northwest libtard is a very specific breed. And it made sense because I have been to other places that felt like they were dressing up as that. Like that's what they aspired to be. And I felt like I saw the original. I was like, oh, this is who you're copying. And they're somehow even worse.
Everybody else is just the cheap knockoff.
Yeah, exactly.
So I used to have to drive into Portland every week for an outside sales job that I had. So I am very familiar with the downtown areas in there. You know, I would like walk the Capitol at night and do stupid stuff like that with my friends. And it was, we probably didn't realize how stupid that was at the time. Like 18, 19, walking around, just homeless people like surrounding you everywhere. And I'm like, oh, it's like going to the zoo again. Don't do this. It's bad. It's not moral. But at the time it was like entertaining, you know?
Yeah, it was.
Now I'm 29. I'm like, okay, no, this is just really sad, you know?
Yeah, I had a similar experience. I lived in kind of one of these like crumbling urban centers in the American South, and there was this old theater, like really really old, like maybe 20 screen theater that had been boarded up on all sides, but the upper windows had been like smashed out, and every night when I lived there, it was like a zombie movie. Like it would get dark and you'd see movement and people would just start like pouring out of this theater. And it was like one of the creepiest things ever. Cause like you would kind of do the math. You're like, it's probably like 70, 80 people just in there, like in the dark all day. And yeah, I'm very happy to live in a place where there are no homeless people now.
Well, it's funny you say that. It's like it's 26 out here in South Dakota now, and I live in a town of like 700 people. So there is actually zero homeless people here because homeless people cannot survive here.
Yeah, that's the advantage of living in the far north. It gets too cold.
Well, yeah, and there's no big city for 40 miles, right? So there's literally nowhere for them to go. So,
well, honestly, that's
like
always...
a lot about that, isn't there? It's like there's no chance to be homeless, so therefore you're no homeless. You know, like people have to find a way to not be homeless, so they end up not.
Yeah, that's an interesting thought process.
Yeah.
It's I definitely don't miss it having lived in a bigger city for a portion of my life. If you have the same interests that we do, you just realize, why do I live in a place where everything I want to do is illegal and everyone hates me?
Correct. Yeah.
It's a pretty easy trade to make.
Oh, 100%. And so like the move to South Dakota was like, people are nice. Everybody waves at you. Like a year into living here, people are like, oh yeah, you're the new guy. You live over there on 2nd Street, or whatever it is. Cause they recognize you because you haven't been there for 30 years. Right. It's just such a different dynamic and a different type of person in the rural farmlands, than like these people who do actually hate you, right? And especially as, I have a wife, I have 3 kids now, 3 little kids. I'm just never living around people who I don't trust. It's just not worth it, so what? I don't have a 24-hour gas station 5 minutes away, That's the main downside. Life isn't as convenient, but it's 100 times better.
Yeah, it's a really interesting point. It's something I talk about a lot about on this show, right? Is that like, yeah, sure, like there's no free lunch. You're going to have to give something up, which actually, weirdly enough, is something true both in your living arrangements and your choice in firearms and firearms accessories, right? Mm-hmm. Which is like, at a certain point, like you can't have it all. You have to make some sacrifices. And having, lived at a point in my life where I was, working a good job in a cool area with lots of things to do and to buy, but also living in a place where there's like a decrepit movie theater full of like 100 crazy meth heads and everything got stolen. And I'd walk outside and see human poop everywhere. You're like, you know what? Maybe I don't care about a fresh market on my block. Maybe there are other things in life.
Yeah, there's something more important than this. I don't know if this is healthy for anyone to live like this.
Oh, 100%. I mean, look, like you go there and you see the people there, they're not healthy. So obviously, you and I could probably talk about, cities for a long time. I genuinely hate most cities in America. But, one of the things that I think would be useful for my audience who isn't necessarily super interested in gun stuff. So let's say, you're a guy, you're out of school, you got a decent job, no experience with guns. Where do you start, right? If you're in that situation?
Well, you see, you start with a $5,000 Knight's armament and you call it a day. Then you strap on like a $200 Strike Eagle, Vortex Strike Eagle, and you're good to go.
100%. Look, the most important
the best advice that I give to people is please do not ask me about other platforms. It's going to be an AR-15. You're going to buy an AR-15. If you have a little bit of money, you can start with a bottom of the barrel PSA. It might work for a couple thousand rounds and you'll probably end up upgrading some parts, but that's a good learning experience. I wouldn't recommend it as I'm never going to train with this and I'm going to defend or, depend on it to defend my life or the life of my loved ones with. But if you just need something to start with, it's a good start and you can upgrade. If you have a little bit more money, I think there are better brands out there. BCM gets thrown around a lot. There are some smaller builders out there as well that will put together a really high quality AR-15 for you. I've heard really good things about like Munition Works and Bear Arms, who essentially use off-the-shelf parts, but the assembly is very important, and there are people that do it really well. And so if you have a little bit more money, that BCM, some of these other guys are going to do a really, really good job for that.
So I'm curious, does that mean that your first purchase is a rifle?
Well, it depends. I guess it depends on where you live. Most people should start with a handgun. Handguns are more difficult. They're less useful, but you can carry them everywhere. So if that is your primary concern, yeah, start with a handgun. Now, when it comes to handguns, obviously Glock is the big one. I don't particularly love Glocks, but if you want something that's reliable and that you can train with and get better with, a Glock is a great way to start. You can also go an M&P 2.0, fantastic option. The Walther PDPs, great option. CZs, great options. You don't need anything fancy. You can find fantastic handguns for in between $400 and $500 that are going to dependably and reliably get the job done. But most of what I do is rifles because I hate handguns. I hate shooting handguns. It's just something I'm forced to do because it's a necessary skill, basically.
Yeah, you sound exactly like my one of my main shooting buddies who has been dragged kicking and screaming to be even semi-competent at shooting a pistol because he hates it. I enjoy it. I certainly get your point. It is by every objective standard a worse weapon. Really, the only advantage is I could put this in a pocket, and even an 11.5 is, shall we say, somewhat inconvenient to fit under your coat.
Suboptimal inside of your pants, for sure. Now, so if your audience isn't familiar, handguns, they just require a lot more time and intentionality to get good with, essentially. So they're not easy to control the recoil, especially if you're somebody with reduced strength. Whereas with almost any rifle, you can basically just point in the direction, pull the trigger, you'll figure it out very easily. But handguns do take a lot more intentional training, time, energy, and unfortunately money to get good with, because you're going to end up spending, if you want to actually get good, you're going to spend a lot of time dry firing, and you're going to spend a lot of time on the ammunition.
Yeah, that's an interesting point, right? Buying a gun is sort of similar to the actual like listed price of a house, right? Which is like, it's a significant portion, but that is not your final total, right? Like you need to budget for all more.
Yeah, I would say it's like the down payment on a house.
Yeah, exactly, right? Like that is a component, right? And it's important, but you know, so many people I think get kind of like obsessed with a certain dollar amount as like all you're going to spend. And there's no two ways about it, right? It is at a certain point, it's expensive. It's going to cost you money. Now, do you need to spend, you know, insert X, you know, incredibly overpriced, you know, gun price? Like, no, you don't. Something, you know, cheap and cheerful will work. But I mean, I think that, you know, if you're not already interested in guns, like if it doesn't tickle your autism, it's just a useful skill to have, right? Like you should be dangerous, you should be capable. And that's something that can be done. It just requires a little bit of work, right? It's an extremely perishable skill. And if you're not, you know, constantly brushing up on it, it's going to go away quickly.
Yeah, 100%. Again, it's just one of those things that budgeting is important, right? Especially if you're somebody on limited funds like most of us are. So you're probably not going to go out there and, you know, spend $3,000 on your STI or whatever they call it now. Or, you know, most people, unfortunately, with the consumerism thing, having the item is hot and sexy. That's what they want to have and show off and take pictures of it. And then they're like, oh, a case of ammo is, you know, $250. That's way too much money. Right. Or they just don't have the time to go out and train. So it really does come down to being able to put in the effort. Now, fortunately, dry fire is free. And if your audience doesn't know what dry fire, that's basically practicing weapon manipulations with no ammunition. So like finding your sights, pulling the trigger, reloading. You can do all of that stuff without ever firing a single round. But recoil control and actually like using it in live fire is super important. But you can fortunately kind of mitigate some of those costs by spending 15, 20 minutes a day dry firing, doing stuff like that.
Yeah. And that's definitely something, you know, I've seen in my own kind of progression, right? Because look, we've talked about, you know, the kind of like rampant consumerism, you need to buy this or you'll die kind of stuff. But there are things that are just objectively better, right? Like it is shooting a handgun with an optic is for pretty much everyone. Once you get used to it, going to make you better. But it's a very difficult thing to do, right? At least as you're picking it up, right? And so that process of just like, it sounds stupid, but getting your reps in, right? Going through the motions, figuring out how to do it is free. You get to make, you know, gun noises and point a gun at yourself in the mirror. That could be kind of fun. But you actually do get a genuine skill out of it. And you can take something that, you know, ordinarily people would say, oh, it takes you this many hours to do, which could cost you a lot of money. Or, you know, you can just run the reps yourself and basically skip the front half of that learning curve, right? Like it's not super entertaining. You know, it's not like the cool thing you want to take photos of and put on social media. Right. But if your end goal is actually getting better at the skill, that's how you do it.
Well, right. In some ways, it's like working out, right? So if you work out once a month, once every 6 months, you're going to have exactly zero progress. But if, like me, you're working out, you know, 4 times a week at least, and you're trying to get a 500-pound deadlift, a 400-pound squat, and a 300-pound bench, well, you're going to have to put in some work. And you're going to have to be not only just put in the work, but be intentional when you're doing it. Have goals, you know, for shooting, if you want to use that analogy. A timer works really well, so you can actually measure how fast you are, you know, take note of how your hits are, use smaller targets, shoot at further distances, all that sort of stuff to kind of stretch your capabilities, if you will. You know, it's like a lot of things. You know, if you want to get good at performance driving, well, guess what? You're going to have to spend some time on the track and spend some money. You're going to have to get fuel. You're going to have to get tires, do all this sort of stuff. So I think that it is very important, especially for all of us here in America, that we actually not only have these rights, but exercise them and get good with them so that, because again, you can own the things, you can buy the things, but if you don't have the skills to back it up or to actually use them in application, you're just going to be a high value loot drop for somebody else who has put in the work.
Well, at a certain point, right? Like when lefties say, people treat guns like fetishes or magic objects, in many cases, they're not actually that wrong. Like people kind of treat them like dream catchers, right?
Mm-hmm.
Where it's like, I'll put this under my bed and it will protect me from the evil eye, which is this like, well, simply by owning it, it has granted me protection. And that's not true, right? It's a tool with a skill associated with it. I mean, it's like saying, well, I own boxing gloves, therefore I'm going to fight Mike Tyson, or not current Mike Tyson, the like 90s version of him. Currently, you probably have a pretty decent chance. Anyway, not to make fun of the elderly. But point is, right? Like it actually, there's
abuse.
Yeah, exactly. I like how we as a country were like, it's too mean to make Biden be the president. Put Mike Tyson in the ring and make him suffer. I think this country is just addicted to making old people suffer.
Dude, well, if you want to talk about like a form of degeneracy is when or decadence is when the entertainment becomes so, it has to become wild and just insane in so many different ways for it to actually like impress people, I suppose. Like boxing is too boring now, so now we're going to do MMA. We're going to increase the violence, and if it's boxing, it needs to be a spectacle of some famous person beating up another famous. Like we have to combine things together, right? So I'm going to have a movie star box a TikTok star, and that's going to be it, because a regular boxing match is no longer exciting enough for us, right?
Well, look, as maybe this is a situation I should not comment on, is the number one fan of the police activity YouTube channel. But no, I get your point, right? I was actually just talking with my wife about this because, and this is going to be difficult to say for the sake of YouTube because it's a little bit untoward, but one of the weird trends in movies, right, is, ever since Game of Thrones, the like edgy, cool thing you could do, right, to show that you were really out there. So first it was like full frontal nudity, then it was full frontal male nudity. And that was like a progressive thing. Like, oh, we're, abolishing the nudity gap in a movie. Mm-hmm. But the recent one, and again, forgive me for saying this, I understand it's a little bit untoward, but it's relevant to the conversation, is that, there's this movie that came out, it's called like Saltburn or something. And there've been a kind of like a couple copycat films, which have basically been showing like forcible male sodomy, right, on screen. Like, oh, that's the thing, right? Mm-hmm. And you see that even over the course of my life, right? The like, wow, Game of Thrones is so shocking and edgy. To, 10 years later, it's like, well, in order to get that same visceral reaction from people, you have to like really, really jack up, the amount of shock value to it. And so like we were talking earlier about, like the downsides of living in the city. And, one of the things that I noticed that I didn't really like about myself living in a city is that I got incredibly callous to like just human suffering, right? Like I saw like, it's horrible to say, but like I saw a guy overdose and die in front of my apartment and I just walked past it. I mean, like to be fair, the ambulance was there. He was very visibly already dead. It's not like I could do anything, right? Mm-hmm. But like looking back on that, I was like, I don't like how that just didn't affect me at the time. And, some of that people do to themselves, right? Like with media or entertainment. But another part of it's environmental. And like, I don't know, one of the things is like that instinct is in you for a good reason, right? And just deadening it on this kind of like meaningless stimulus is probably not good for you or good for your soul.
100%. I mean, culturally, we have become desensitized to so much. Like you said, like with the progression of degeneracy in media, with the quote unquote TikTok, what's it called, brain rot that's out there, where there needs to be a constant dopamine hit, and if there's any sort of negative emotions, we just suppress it and walk by it. Basically, funnily enough, I've heard similar stories to what you just said of people living in cities, and there'll be a homeless guy OD'd on the ground, and it's like, do I help him and get stabbed with a needle, or do I just walk on by? Do I call the cops? And then a lot of people choose just to do nothing in that situation, right? And it's it's a dangerous situation, but it's also at the same time, it's like, well, we're both human beings. We should try and help each other out, surely. But society's gotten to a point where it sounds callous to say, but it's like it's almost not worth helping out our fellow man for the ramifications. Like if we do something wrong, if we injure somebody, it comes back on us. The easiest thing is to do nothing.
Well, that's the whole like Daniel Penny thing, right? He restrained a guy who was flipping out on the subway trying to hurt people. And I mean, he's on trial for murder, right? And you see that happen a couple times and you're like, all right, not today. I'm not going to help anyone out. And like what you were talking about, living in a small town, is you live among people where you are 100% sure that will never happen for, let's just say, a multitude of reasons.
Mm-hmm. Right. Well, yeah, it's funny. There's like bikes and whatnot outside of our, there's like one apartment complex in my little town. And there's, like kids' bikes and everything just laying on the out front. And that's because there are no bike thieves out here. Right. It's just what it is. Right. So, I'm at church at a place that we haven't been going for very long. And my kids are running around and they're like 4 and 2. Right. And I don't feel any sort of like, where my kids go? They're not on my side. I can't see them. What's going on? It's like, no, they're just over there playing with like 10 other kids. It's fine. Who cares?
Yeah. That kind of high trust society. You can't put a price tag on it. Right.
No, not at all. Well, and it's funny because, yeah, in the old days in a high trust society, wintertime was coming, you cannot be ostracized from the group, right? That is essentially a death sentence to be ostracized from the group in like, the 1500s or something during wintertime, right? You get kicked out of your village and it's like, okay, well, now we just starve and die horribly over the next couple weeks. It's going to be fantastic. So there's kind of not a social contract, but there's an underlying understanding that we all depend on each other and what one of us does affects the others, and we need to not break each other's trust, right? Because otherwise we are going to be excommunicated and have serious negative consequences, where now there's almost no consequences, right? So you can go out, be as degenerate as you want, get kicked out of bars, and then just do it the next night in the next town, right?
Well, no, it's 100% correct. And I think one of the things that, and this, I'll trigger our, shall we say, more kind of like conservative or libertarian friends by saying this, right? Is that, when we talk about freedom, that's a term that has a lot of definitions, right? And the kind of freedom that basically runs, freedom is, my ability to fulfill myself in any way whatsoever with no like moral limitation, right? Like whatever, combination of stimuli and stacked genitalia I choose, that's good because I consent to it. Well, one, how free does that make you? And two, that really destroys the ability of people to have a kind of, a more restrained form of freedom, right? Which is like, okay, your ability to do that destroys my freedom to walk around in a safe neighborhood, right? Mm-hmm. Or my freedom to, let my kids out at night, right? Because, you are doing things that make you feel good, but have a massive knock-on effect on others. And so, I do get a little bit frustrated with the kind of like the language around freedom, because in many cases they're saying something in very good faith that they mean, but oftentimes they don't understand that, like, if you take that to its logical conclusion, you don't get people like you get people like Portland, or you get people like, New York. And anyway, this is maybe a discussion for another time, but yeah, it's something I think about a lot as I just kind of chin stroke on the internet. But FocusTripp,
I do want to touch on that right before we get off here. So I'm a Christian. So 1 Peter 2:16 is a great one for this. Anytime somebody brings up the concept of freedom, and it essentially says, "As free, yet not using liberty as a cloak for vice." And that's what a lot of people say when they mean freedom, like the more degenerate side. Say, I should be free to be as evil as I want to be. And it's like, well, your evil unfortunately affects the rest of us. So we're gonna put a stop to that now, if you don't mind.
Well, and this is something that, like, look, I'm not Lutheran, but I've read some Luther, right? Mm-hmm. And when he talks about, crime and punishment and forgiveness, right? He basically says that there are kind of like 4 levels of forgiveness. The worst is basically to hate someone personally and just let it go, right? then it kind of goes up from there of, forgiving them personally. But the ultimate form of that is to both, personally forgive someone and then also turn them into the authorities and have them face the full force of the law. And the reason is because, one, like that kind of like sense of hatred and revenge is personally poisoning to you, but also because it is good for both society, but also that person to be punished, right? That is the right and ordered nature of things. And, this idea that, the way to be, good and kind and nice to people is to let them do whatever they want, to let them just smoke crack in the street all day because it would be mean to ask them not to. I mean, this very clearly produces an awful society. I don't feel like this is an argument we need to deal with anymore.
You don't even have to, because it's like, okay, let the guy smoke crack. It's like, yeah, but he has a wife and kids at home that he's leaving, so maybe he shouldn't be able to do that,
Yeah.
Because his terror, maybe you're sleeping around with other women, I don't know if that's, applicable to anything going on right now, but
maybe you're on a breeding fetish.
Again, maybe your actions have consequences that lead to multiple broken homes, and maybe we shouldn't do that. Maybe that's going to lead to a half dozen kids not growing up with a father, and then whatever, we can look at the statistics, right? We can pull up the statistics and see how fatherless kids do compared to their counterparts. It's not great.
Well, 100%, man. But honestly, dude, thank you so much for coming out. This was a much better conversation than I thought it would be. Again, I know you mentioned it before, but where could people find more of your stuff?
Yeah, so on YouTube, FocusTripp and Gun.Deals are the two channels of which I upload content to, and then my company, which you don't need to check out. Nothing's in stock. It's a hypebeast company, but that is Focus Shooting LLC.
Again, highly recommend his video reviews. He's 100% wrong about the Elk Inspector, the best optic to ever be created. I can mute you so you can't respond to that. But nonetheless, his YouTube channel is very good. Highly recommend it. As far as my stuff, the Jay Burden Show is available on Apple, Spotify, YouTube, anywhere you listen to podcasts. If you want to support us, you can either do that directly through the links in the description or check out our sponsor, Axios Remote Fitness and Coaching. If you want to also be a well-muscled Chad who can deadlift 500 pounds, Axios Remote Fitness and Coaching, best way to do it. Again, FocusTripp, I appreciate it. And to everyone at home, keep your head up. Life can't last forever. Good night. Hop, welcome to Jay Burden Show. How you doing, man?
Doing very good.
Yeah, I'm excited to have you on. I've had a few guys from the GunTube side of thing on my podcast, and been a fan of your channel for a while. I think you and I share a similar, I don't want to say proclivity, but maybe mental disease that is an affection for Ruger P Series pistols. And so I think I found whenever you did that video 3-4 years ago, and I've been watching ever since. But obviously I'm familiar with your work, but my audience might not be. So who are you and what do you do?
So yeah, I have a YouTube channel all about guns. It's just called Hop now. It used to be called Hoplifile, which is a really esoteric inside joke that everybody assumes is a dog whistle for something, but it's not. It's also impossible to spell. So just look up Hop and then keep scrolling until you see something with a gun in it. But yeah, I think I do basically everything. Like I enjoy every aspect of firearms and like the gun community. I like current gun history. So I always like to know what's coming out. I like to review new products. I like to do high end stuff like night vision. And I also love old stuff. I like the history of where we came from. So I have old pistol reviews like the Ruger P Series. And yeah, tactical gear. I don't know. I like everything about it. I think it's all one, it's all one hobby to me. I don't really see the distinction between, new products coming out and old products from 20, 30 years ago, because something that's coming out tomorrow is eventually going to be 20 years old. And it's like, it's valuable to know where it all comes from. So yeah, my channel is insanely eclectic. And luckily, I'm able to put together an audience of all these different groups of people who will enjoy some videos and tolerate other videos.
Yeah, it's sort of an interesting thing. You see a somewhat similar dynamic in other sort of like hyper technical hobbies. Like cars are the same way, where you have like the guys who are just all they care about is like the new thing with big numbers, right? Like, oh, the new Mustang has X% more horsepower than the old one. But then also you have the guys who are into weird eclectic stuff, and there's every sort of micro niche. And look, like guns are tools. They're practical. There's a certain bare minimum level of functionality you need
to be considered something you can bet your life on. But like many people, you sort of reach that floor relatively quickly. You know, you've got the one rifle, the one handgun. And then the next question is like, okay, what do I do after this? And while certainly you see those people who sort of make like endless variations on the same couple things, after that point, it's kind of like, well, what are you into? You know, and obviously late 90s service pistols, I guess, are a pretty popular destination.
Yeah, I guess I can understand the perspective of somebody who's like, I'm really only interested in the newest cutting edge stuff. Like, why would they care about, a Ruger P series? It's discontinued. Like, sure, maybe you can find one cheap in a pawn shop, and that might make it a bit of a relevant thing where you're like, I'm really hard up for cash and I need a good pistol. Then you start looking into sort of the cheap classics you can find on the pawn shop shelf. But for the most part, I get it. Like, if somebody be completely uninterested in old handguns or old firearms history, that's okay to a certain extent. There are people who are so disinterested in the history of the industry or firearms technology or whatever that they just are lacking context, and they'll be like, oh my gosh, 1X prism sights. Primary Arms came out with this whole series of 1X, essentially non-magnified prism optics, which is an uncommon thing to see. And everybody was like, wow, this is a revolutionary game changer. It's not a new thing. I have one I'm working on a video. Loophole made that 25 years ago, and it wasn't popular then because it's not a good idea. It's not really a good optic for most people. So it's like everything's been tried before. If someone is really trying to sell you on like brand new technology, be skeptical, because it's probably old technology that was unpopular for a while. So I would suggest that anybody who's really, really into guns should at least look back a couple of years to see how things have actually changed and improved. But if you're not interested in the 50-year time span, that's understandable. What completely insane to me is people who are only interested in the retro stuff, because I'm like, it's retro, what's retro? It's the golden age of your childhood. So I will admit that my keen interest is in the 90s, because I was a kid in the 90s and I would see all the stuff in media, but obviously I didn't get to buy or shoot guns because I was a poor child. But anybody who's like really interested in history, GWAT is now becoming a retro. So there are people who are fixated on the GWAT and they're like, I love this historical firearm. New ARs, ooh, gross. M-Lock, that's gross. But it's like, well, quad rail. There was, I'm sure, a time at which people were like, ew, quad rail, gross. Like, what? Why do you need that? What's wrong with the plastic?
Yeah, the clamshell works great.
Exactly. So if you like the history of firearms, I think you should be into the whole history of firearms. That's my opinion.
Yeah, and I think that to your point about the historical context, one of the things that I appreciate about your work, and this is actually the thing that drove me out of, because look, there's sort of the dark trifecta of male interests, like cars, guns, and watches. And if you have all three, you just have no money. Your life is ruined. Yep. So you have to kind of pick like 1 to 2 legs that you can sort of spend time on. And, as someone who grew up around guns, it was something that was in my life, but not a primary interest. And the thing that really drove me away from cars as a hobby was honestly social media, because it completely ruined it. Because one, there's a finite number of cars past a certain era, right? They don't make any more 2006 Nissan 350Zs. And once the whole thing became sort of a hype game, right? Like what can you do to attract attention? It kind of ruined the fun of it. Whereas the thing that I admire about your work, and the thing that sort of attracted me to it relatively early, is obviously there's very much a gun hype culture. I'm not on Instagram, haven't been in years, but even 5 years ago, there was the, shall we say, very aesthetics focused version of gun culture, where honestly it has no more relevance to the actual mechanics of the product itself. It's sort of a prop, right? In the same way that, I don't know anything about fashion, but streetwear was in 2018 to 2020, right? It was a series of branded items you could photograph yourself next to sort of increase your sort of like online, I guess, like clout would be the term the kids use.
Yeah, that certainly makes sense. There is an aspect of what would you call it, like conspicuous consumption or something. I remember something that I learned when I was in college, because I have a degree in Japanese nonsense, but one of the things that I always thought was really interesting was that during period of time in Japan, I believe it was the Edo period, so like the 1800s ish. I'm probably getting this all wrong because that's more than 10 years ago, but there were austerity measures in place. And so it's like nobody can be seen to be flaunting wealth, but certain things were not regulated. And so you would have like a little cigar or not, like a tobacco pouch, and you could have a little bead on there, and the bead would be of just exquisite craftsmanship, and it would signal to other people that like you have a lot of money. So it's like even in an environment where austerity measures are enforced strictly, people still find a way to flash some cash in public, right? And social media is going to be that same way. So when you look at like an AR-15, there's really cheap entry-level AR-15s, which could just be trash blasters or, a defensive firearm for somebody without a lot of money. And there's the mid-range of stuff, which is like high-end, serious duty-grade firearms. But you can spend as much money as you want, where you get into stuff that I would consider like a luxury firearm, sort of like a luxury watch. Like you can spend $4,000 on a Noveske. Is a Noveske rifle more than twice as good as a BCM? No, it's probably a little worse than a BCM, but it costs way more. And people see that logo and they see that paint job and they're like, damn, that guy has money. And sometimes I will admit, like when I put on the body armor and the helmet and the night vision, I'm like, dude, I'm wearing 20 grand right now. Holy crap. This is awesome. I try not to do that too much.
Reformed Elcan owner, so
There you go. Yeah,
very aware.
Yeah, and people. Then there's other people that are a little more sensible who will be like, "Why would I ever pay $600 for a scope? My whole rifle only costs $800." You're like, yeah, I can see that perspective, but I can also remember some like old advice you would get from hunters. Like if you go on Sniper's Hide or something, these old forums, they'd be like, your scope needs to cost at least as much as your rifle. If you're going to get a good piece of glass, it's got to cost at least as much as the gun. So these attitudes change over time, and they also change, depending on where you are in the community. And some people perceive value in different ways. So one of my favorite online memes is somebody with a Daniel Defense rifle. It's a $2,000 rifle, very good duty grade, high end AR. And they care a lot about their AR. They really want it to be good, high quality. They probably don't mind showing off the cost of it a little bit as well. But then when it comes to optics, they just don't know. They don't know what the difference is between different scope companies or different types of scope. And so they just slap a $200 Vortex Strike Eagle on top, because to them, the optic is just, it doesn't interest them. They've never been like told about the hype of it. If they were a little more well-educated, they might as well just buy that Elcan. Money, probably not really a thing for them if they're buying Daniel Defense rifles just casually. They just don't realize that there's a whole world out there of Elcan snobs. And if they knew, they would not be putting a Strike Eagle on top of their precious Daniel Defense.
Well, I feel like the area you see this the most in is 2011s for the non-autistically inclined double stack 1911s, widely variable price. And when I'm talking widely variable, I mean 500 to, as you said earlier, as many thousands as you want to give someone.
Yep.
And obviously you have the extreme diminishing returns, right? Where it's like, okay, this is a cool thing to have. I like nice handguns as much as the next guy. But at a certain point, you are flexing, right? Like, okay, yeah, you got the one that you had done exactly how you wanted it. And it's very clearly like this, kind of like transformer abomination of like sharp curves and different finishes. And it's like, okay, there's nothing wrong with it, but let's not delude ourselves why we're here. You want to be seen to be wealthy. And to your point about the Edo period and tobacco boxes, which I'm going to go ahead and assume you were completely right in all the details there, and we will be corrected later. But this is something you even read about with the Greeks, right? There were, again, all of these sort of sumptuary laws, is I think the term in British common law, right? Where it's like, okay, we need to put some sort of check on this because we don't want an immense amount of resources going to flexing. And again, life finds a way, right? There will be some way to sort of artificially, or I guess not artificially, organically, reinforce that hierarchy. And it's funny to see it over and over and over again, because if you've been interested in any hobby whatsoever, where there is gear involved, there's immediately gear snobbery. And it's kind of interesting because one of the things that I appreciate in the analysis from you and Brock is this idea that, look, not necessarily, obviously, there are things that are too cheap to be usable, things that are too expensive to be usable. But what matters more, right, is effectively where do you find yourself on that trade-off curve, right? Like you can buy as much capability as you want, assuming you have the bank account to balance it up. The question is, one, can you use it? Do you need it? And is there a better option? And look, like I got an equally useless finance degree, right? I learned absolutely nothing because it was COVID and nobody learned anything. But the idea of effectively there is no solution. You're simply making trade-offs on kind of a multivariable equation. It's something I see in guns all the time. Like I'm sure you're aware of the current obsession with like 3 to 15 scopes. It's a little bit passé now, but it's this idea of, well, a 1 to 6 LPVO is good. And if that must be good, surely a 1 to 8 or a 1 to 10, obviously 2 to 4x better, therefore. And obviously a 1x is basically a 2x, which is basically a 3x. And you see this scope creep, literally. And all of a sudden we've reinvented the sort of like forum joke rifles of the 2010s, where it was a quad rail with every slot filled up with some random garbage. And I think that's another sort of interesting kind of human foible you see in this.
Yeah, there's a lot of scope creep's a good term for it. There's also just the cyclical nature of trends. That's like you can see this happening. The discussion will shift every couple of weeks on gun Twitter or gun Instagram or whatever community that you happen to be on. But somebody will rediscover ACOGs. They'll be like, you know what? Actually, the ACOG is still the best optic. And you're like, oh, well, okay. Maybe it is, maybe it isn't. The fact of the matter is, it's been a beloved optic since it was introduced in 1987. It's been around for a very, very long time. How many times have we gone through this cycle? Kind of like Mass Effect, where you're like, you're young, you've only been doing this for a handful of years. I've been doing this for 10 years, or people have been doing this for 40 years, and they're probably well beyond the point of rolling their eyes at that, well, actually, ACOGs are still good argument, because they probably have seen it every 5 years since 1987, and they're like, ridiculous. And those generally come from people who are either they've had the ACOG all along and they're sick of seeing all these trends pass them by. And they're like, hey, wait a second, you guys, my optic is still good. And they're correct. Their optic is still good. But no one ever has the self-restraint to say, this is still an option. Instead, they got to be like, no, this is still the only way to do it. Conveniently, the way I'm doing it is still the only way to do it. And you guys are all the same. But yeah, you do get that constant escalation of like, well, 1 to 6 LPVO, but then I'm still going to put a red dot on top because I want to use it for close range shooting and potentially passive aiming with night vision. Well, as long as I got that red dot in there, I don't need the 1x on the LPVO anymore. So I might as well go to a 2 to 10. Well, yeah, 2 is basically 3 and 10 is basically 15. So let's go ahead and just go to a 3 to 15. Well, 4 to 16, that's a little bit more, and those scopes have some other advantages. So yeah, it can just keep theory crafting your way into almost any setup that you want.
Well, and I think another relevant factor is sort of the impact of the sort of like ever-changing face of social media, which is in order to make content, you need to constantly have new things to talk about. And the problem is, you mentioned optimization. And obviously you can always fine-tune those variables. But if you're a normal person, right, you have like 1 or 2 systems to optimize. Right, and I realize system is a weighted word if we're talking about guns, but let's go with it. How long can you really draw that process out for? I mean, like someone like you and I, years, just by constantly changing things. But if your genuine goal was just to figure out like what is the best one-time financial purchase for me, there's only so much discussion. But in a world where like we need more Reddit posts, we need more videos. And I say this as someone who himself releases a lot of content, right? So I recognize the sort of hypocrisy in it. But it seems as if that mixed with that desire to sort of signal status creates this kind of like ever tightening spiral of needing new things to be what everyone is talking about, if you see what I'm getting at.
Yeah, there's also a disconnect that I see between guys who treating firearms as a part of their other hobby or pursuit. There's a lot of like the guys who are into the Minuteman thing, or or just like really focused on defensive shooting. And they're like, why do you need all this stuff? And you're like, nobody needs anything, man. Like, you need a Glock 43 probably at maximum, and you'll be good to go, because that's going to cover all your use cases, which is having a defensive firearm every day in your regular life. But if you're really interested in escalating that to, a different level of preparedness, if you're one of these Minuteman guys, then you do want to have, a nice chest rig setup, or a plate carrier, helmet, a nice rifle, well set up. You don't need more than 2 or 3 firearms maximum. So for you, it would be totally acceptable to say, why do I need to keep chasing this dragon? And the answer is you don't. Like, you can make one workable setup and then stop worrying about it, because concern over optimization is a bit of a fool's errand. Everything has trade-offs, and the only issue is if you are not strong-willed enough to disregard the trade-offs. You see someone's like, well, I have more magnification than you. You're like, dang, my scope sucks. No, it doesn't. They have more magnification than you. Trust me, there's a trade-off. They made a trade-off to get that. You're still fine with what you got. So if you truly aren't actually that into firearms, then go ahead and get your one gun, set it up the way that it works for you, and then, use it and become proficient in it. But most of the people who are doing this and who are watching these videos and making these posts are more into firearms than that. They enjoy the hobby. Same with car guys. It's like, if you really don't care about cars, you're not like watching every episode of regular car reviews, because you just have your commuter vehicle, and that's the only car you need.
2018 Versa is exactly what you will need.
Exactly. If you're watching regular car reviews, then you're into cars more generally. And that doesn't mean that every single car review video you see is a commandment for you to go purchase that car. Same thing with guns. If you're interested in guns, I watch a ton of gun YouTube. I don't immediately buy every single product. I don't immediately tear my stuff apart every time I see a new video. I like to just know what's out there and have that knowledge in the back of my mind, because at some point I will be buying a new scope to try it. And there are a lot of people doing that. And so I think railing against the perceived consumerist nature, there is absolutely a consumerist kind of aspect to it. But for the most part, it's like, this is just information that you can take or leave. You don't have to be buying everything that you see on YouTube. You don't have to be trying to keep up with the guys who do this for a living, for everything is a tax write-off. If you're just into guns, you can just watch the videos and enjoy them. That is possible.
Yeah, and I think that it reminds me very much of and I'll forget the number on this. Was it the nut and fancy second type of cool, right? Where it's like, look, like, you can just like things. That's entirely, you are allowed to say, I think it's just neat. And as the owner of, shall we say, a rather unfortunate amount of inherited, converted black powder Old West guns, right? It's like, I'm under no illusions whatsoever that a Italian-made, dubiously converted Walker Colt revolver is at all a practical thing to own, but it's kind of cool, right? It's a neat thing to have. And I think that one of the sort of interesting things about the gun sphere as a consumer, but still an outsider, right? Like, I don't know a lot of these people, but is the sort of blurred line between, do I like this, or is this something I am buying? And we'll debate how sincere this argument is, but to prepare for something, right? Because that's sort of a line that's blurred, right? Because obviously there are things that are incredibly practical, right? Like, you don't really own, level 4 plates because, you're collecting them. I mean, I'm sure that guy exists. I don't know if I really want to meet them, but I'm sure that there's one of them out there. It's a certain degree a risk calculation. And, with some other things, I think it gets a little bit blurry. And maybe that's just, how do I justify this extremely absurdly expensive purchase, which, fair enough. But it is an interesting thing to sort of, I guess, observe. So one of the other things I wanted to talk with you about is the evolution of gun culture. Now, a certain amount of this is generational, right? Boomer bashing is sort of the internet's favorite pastime, one that I want to engage in. But as someone who sort of came into gun culture early in the sort of 2010s, I joked earlier, like in the transition from the quad rail to key mod era, anyone who was there will know exactly what I'm talking about. But it was fundamentally a very different group of people. Now, part of it was forum based. That's different than social media, both good and ill. It was much more based in print journalism. But I'm curious, right? When did you come into gun culture, and what changes have you seen since you sort of started here?
Yeah, so I started really focusing on and paying attention to guns and gun culture probably in 2008 or 2009. I was in college. But I didn't really start actually getting into shooting until I graduated, got my first real job. And all of a sudden I had money. It's like, oh man, I can actually finally afford to buy a firearm. So yeah, not until maybe like 2013, 2014 is when I actually started shooting and really getting into, the more like defensive shooting aspect of it. Got my first handgun, got my concealed carry license, started practicing shooting handgun drills a lot. I used to be almost exclusively a handgun guy, and I didn't really care. I didn't really think about rifles as anything other than kind of a curiosity. So like all my first AR builds were embarrassing Reddit tier meme cringe, where I was like, I'm going to build something so cursed it'll ruin somebody's day. And that's still happens out there, but that's not as common. It used to be a lot more common. People just like, I'm going to make something so stupid it'll trigger people. You're like, well, you're really only playing yourself.
Yeah, I was about
Or
to
as
say,
Hulk Hogan says, you're working yourself into a shoot when you're doing that.
Joke's on them. I spent hundreds of dollars
exactly.
on a broken piece of junk.
Yeah, I always call it, it's farming for performative outrage. You want to post something on Reddit and then someone's going to be like, oh my gosh, this ruined my day. Oh, they don't mean that. It didn't affect their day at all. They probably chuckled slightly and hit the upvote. So them saying it ruined their day and you're like, I ruined that guy's day. No, you're all just playing a weird little kabuki theater thing. But yeah, so I started to initially just getting into handguns. And since I kind of like historical stuff in the child in the 90s, got into older pistols. But yeah, I just my interest kept escalating. I started getting into, the gear side of it, the, rifles as well. And then, yeah, eventually I think if you spend enough money and enough time in the industry, eventually you'll become involved in the industry. So that's when I got picked up by TFB TV in 2019, I want to say. Started going to shows and then meeting people. And at that point, it's too late. You're just way, way too deep, way past the event horizon of industry. Like culture, I would say, yeah, culture wise, I was involved from like 2008 to 2019. Very much an outsider interested in the industry, following the industry, reading the discussions, watching all the videos on YouTube and everything. And it wasn't until maybe about 2020 when I started attending industry events and meeting people actually inside the industry that I, fell to that even deeper level.
Two things. One, again, as an outside observer, one of the funniest gaps to me is people who are enough of a hobbyist to say, oh, I want to go to this trade show to see all the cool new stuff. And the other group, which is people who have ever been to a trade show, are like, no, you don't. And obviously, if you know people, it's certainly different. But there's I won't say who, but there is a recurring guest on the channel who works for shall we say, a legacy American manufacturer. And I never know when SHOT Show is, but I can always tell SHOT Show because he's miserable. He's just absolutely looking for a way out. And obviously, there's a difference if you're a reporter, if you're there to look at interesting stuff, or if you're stuck in a booth for 14 hours a day. I can imagine.
Yeah, I would say I enjoy SHOT Show. It's still a really hard week. I mean, we also, at least when the TFB TV crew goes to SHOT Show, we're doing more work than almost anybody else on the media side. Still not as much as the guys who have to put up the booth 2 days before and take it down 2 days after. And I mean, they're actually working a real job. We're doing a fairly high effort media job. Still, it's not the same party experience as it is for a lot of people attending.
Well, see, you mentioned earlier the 2008 to 2014 timeframe, which means I assume you remember the Great 22 shortage, right? Just an absolutely inexplicable event. So if you could, I guess this is something that's memorable to people like you and I, but might not be to my audience per se. So do you want to just speak to a little bit that kind of, not to get too political, but like the post-Obama gun culture? Because it was a very specific, I guess, air to it.
Yeah, there's all these different like eras. And so as I was getting into to guns in general, that was as like, for example, the AR market was really starting to explode. And I remember the first channel that I watched extensively was Nothing Fancy. And I remember watching all of his videos at that time right around 2010, when Obama was first elected. Guns were selling like crazy, and ARs had semi-recently come off the assault weapons ban. The assault weapons ban sunset in 2004. And so all of a sudden, you could get all these assault features again, which really is just normal features on a rifle. Rifles were sometimes banned, and during the assault weapons ban, they were banned based on just the name of the gun in very rare cases. But that was such a difficult thing to do and keep up with that a lot of the ban was just based on features. And so what you do is you say, we want to ban every single AR-15. Well, there's an infinite number of manufacturers because a new one could just pop up and say, this is not the AR-15, this is the AX-15. You didn't ban that. So instead you say, okay, we're going to ban flash hiders. We're going to ban bayonet lugs. We're going to ban high capacity detachable magazines. So when that expires, all of a sudden the AR market is accessible again. And it took a couple years to catch up. But when I first started watching Nothing Fancy, I remember he would be reviewing entry-level ARs that cost like $1,200. And that's in 2010 money. And then he would be talking about like AKs. And there was also a big military surplus thing around that time where you could get you could buy 4 Mosin Nagants for $100, shipped straight to your door if you had a CNR license, which is a curio and relic license for collecting antique firearms. And like the money side of it really did have a huge impact on what people were into and what people were talking about. Then, I think people have described Barack Obama as the best gun salesman of all time. People certainly thought he was going to at least attempt to reenact an assault weapons ban. They never pulled that off. But the gun industry during the Obama years was white hot. Absolutely selling record numbers year over year over year. And that is another piece of interesting gun industry history that people don't necessarily know if they're on the outside looking in. That people didn't expect Donald Trump to get elected in 2016. So there was a massive investment to, we're going to invest in more manufacturing, and we're going to take loans out, and we're going to continue cranking guns and selling record numbers of guns year over year during the Hillary Clinton administration. And then that didn't happen, and it was a bloodbath. And right now we're in bloodbath 2. The industry is cratering again. So yeah, it is, a lot of gun buying is politically motivated. If people buy stuff based on fear, I'm worried I'm not going to be able to get this anymore. Same thing with COVID rolls around and everybody's buying toilet paper. Is if you hear a weird little rumor, you might just think maybe I should get on this.
Well, and to speak to that, because I turned 21 during the middle of the whole COVID thing, and buying a gun was just impossible, literally impossible. And so I ended up with what turned out to be a really horrible life choice. This is how I ended up being a CZ fag. Is that the only thing I could buy was a CZ82, which is kind of a cool gun, right? It's sort of like a fancy Makarov. I've told this story before on air, so I won't regale you with it. The only gun I've ever used in a defensive context, and it worked. So, props to that $200 piece of Comblot garbage. But you very much see those trends where there's sort of this external thing, obviously we're sort of past it, but the big ammo shortage from COVID and immediately afterwards, the absolute just bombshell that is the AK market, right? Post sort of Russia sanctions, where there's sort of this push and pull where something happens, creates a shock, and then the industry reacts. It's sort of this bizarre, lag. Let's be honest, it seems as if, from my vantage point, the reasons that thermals are so cool to have now is everyone has seen the somewhat harrowing footage of guys getting wasted with thermals from Ukraine. Now, obviously, that also creates a scarcity because every thermal in the world that's worth anything has been shipped to Ukraine. So that also creates that sort of that scarcity and that, honestly, hype we were talking about earlier. But it's sort of an interesting microcosm of culture more generally, right? This sort of pattern of decision made 2 years later, what has it resulted in? This is actually a question I don't know the answer to, because I was thinking what was after the sort of Great 22 shortage? And in my mental timeline, the very next thing is the zombie craze, which I was sort of too young to really understood where it came from. It was just something that existed. But the example I always think is the green tip, not that green tip, but the Hornady VMAX or ZMAX, right? The special zombie bullets. And
I can't remember the exact
crazy stuff
timeline on that. So I believe, if I remember correctly, the 22 shortage was like one of the weird major things that happened. I think after that was the Sandy Hook shortage. After the Sandy Hook shooting, there was a massive shortage of firearms and ammunition. That's when I was buying my first handgun. And I had done a lot of research for what I wanted to be my first handgun, my first carry gun that I was going to learn to shoot on. And I was also trying to save some money because I was still relatively freshly employed and still pretty much broke. But I couldn't, there was nothing on the shelves at all. So I ended up with my like third choice, which is a Generation 3 Glock 19. And now I will always be a Glock fag basically forever. So it is, funny how
you made a much better desperation choice than I did.
But I had to stretch my budget more than I wanted to. You know, I think my first choice was a Ruger SR9C, which would have been probably like $150, $200 cheaper than the Glock 19 at that point. But they were just gone, you know. So yeah, it's weird how that stuff happens. And then I feel like zombie craze was happening throughout that entire time. From my perspective, maybe I'm wrong. I feel like the whole zombie craze was kicked off by the Zombie Survival Guide. The book by Max Brooks, I think Max Brooks, which is just an awful book. It's full of completely nonsensical firearms advice coming from a guy who probably didn't even Google it. He probably just assumed. But yeah, I think that was patient zero, to coin a phrase that started all the obsession with the movies and games and this whole. There's still this might dox me if someone has seen this truck, but in my hometown, there is still a lifted second gen Chevy Tahoe with all the zombie survival or zombie response team stickers all over it, and it's got like the big sticker on the window that says medkit inside, break glass. Like that was something people were doing for a while. They were like, if you need to break my window to get my medkit in emergency, do it, brother. No. So that was a good time.
Funny story. Whoever that guy is, I think there's at least one of them in every small town because
it's a distributed network. They've got a lot of coverage. 100%.
And some of them are like Japanese soldiers out in the jungle where it's like the war is over. It's been 30 years and they're still just ready to go. Like
you're like, hey man, we're not doing zombies anymore. And they're like, what are you talking about?
But, you know, wife gets a flat tire, you know, use the space saver, whatever, you know, near kind of a rough area of town. So, you know, aware of the surroundings, we'll put it that way. So I'm, you know, in the process of changing the tire and I look over my shoulder and I see this, like, it looks like the Boomer Wojak, like tall white socks, everything just tilted forward, sprinting towards me. And look,
Lord.
Like,
so that's the rage zombies.
Necessarily fit the profile of who I would be worried about, but still it's a large man kind of running towards you. And so I sort of, you know, get up kind of prepared for some sort of altercation. And he is out of breath with one of those, like, you know, those giant, like, off-road Jeep jacks.
Oh yeah, the hijacker lifts.
Spray painted lime green to get my wife's 2009 Volkswagen Rabbit off the ground. And he is having the time of his life in front of, I realize, the zombie response Jeep. Right, which looks exactly how you think it does. And I just made that guy's day. I was like, all right, dude, obviously you are much more prepared for this than I am. So I'll let you do it. But yeah, those guys are, it sort of is a weird, it was like the less, I don't want to say less serious because let's be honest, a lot of these guys weren't exactly our best and brightest, but it was sort of like the redheaded stepchild of the prepper movement, you know, that sort of splintered off where it's like you preparing for, I guess, something, and maybe if this gets you to do something that you may use later in life, it's a net positive, but it was this kind of like bizarre, I guess, kind of like cul-de-sac of like gun culture, prepper culture, and then also like a certain era on the internet too.
I think it was a level of irony that allowed people to do something that they just felt like inside they wanted to do. Like they probably felt good about being generally prepared, but they could sort of couch it in this sort of like, you know, it's just a funny bit that I'm doing, you know, zombie survival isn't that funny. You know, I suspect, like, you know, the Doomsday Preppers show where they trot people out and they essentially humiliate them on TV for their weird beliefs. I don't think you could do that same thing with the zombie survival guys, because they would just be too fun, and the show wouldn't have the same impact. I mean, maybe there's some zombie preppers. Yeah, like they're in on the joke, and you're like, but they're still doing exactly the same thing. They're still stocking rice and beans and cases of 22 long rifle because it bounces around in the skull and destroys the brain. And that's, as we all know, what you're supposed to do.
Max Brooks, big believer. And
big believer. He propagated that myth. He also said the best survival firearm was the M1 carbine because it's lightweight, reliable, and the ammunition is powerful enough. And you're like, where's this 30 carbine ammo coming from, dude? And he also said you should never use a crowbar. I remember he was anti-crowbar, I think, because he was like, it'll just get stuck in the skull. Okay, you hit him with the other side then. I don't know, man.
This isn't rocket science. Yeah, I remember, and this was even as a kid, because I have a very, very vivid memory of having that book confiscated from me at school. Because obviously it had, very kind of violent drawings in it, which is like a teenager. You're like, this is awesome. There's a dude stomping some guy's brains out. And, a very reasonable, concerned teacher was like, hey, bud, sitting in the back of class, drawing pictures of people getting curb stomped. This is a red flag. But
Trench coat collar flipped up around your ears.
See, I went to private school, so we had uniforms.
Oh, okay.
But point is, the thing I always remembered, and even as a kid, I was like, this is cope, was there was a section in that book on body type. And he's like, yeah, the best body type for survival is being fat. So really, being fat is an advantage. And even as a kid, I was like, are we still talking about zombies, or is this you proving a point to someone?
Yeah. Well, and then Zombieland comes out, and they're doing all the rules for survival, and one of their main rules is cardio. And I was like, yeah, that's probably the smartest thing in any zombie movie ever. It's like you need to be able to run really fast. That movie also has rage zombies, so maybe Max Brooks' zombies were the slow type.
Yeah,
I think I got that book. Yeah, the classic zombie. I think I got that book at like a bookstore at a midnight event. It was like, hey, young people, come on down to this midnight event instead of going off and partying or whatever. And then I think that book was like brand new at the time. And so I'd always milling around the bookstore, looking at books and card games and stuff like that. And I picked it up. It's like, oh man, looked through it. I read a handful of pages and I was like, I'm buying this for sure. And I read it. Eventually I read the entire thing and was like, no, wait a second. I have a lot of bones to pick with this guy.
Yeah, I remember it. And again, it was very much kind of like of the age, but all of those kind of zombie properties, I feel like were filled with FUD lore mostly applies to guns, but just the craziest collection of bizarre urban legends kind of combined together in one. Like I remember, and maybe it was Zombie Survival Guides or World War Z. Those books are basically merged into one thing in my brain. So I'm not entirely sure where.
Yeah, World War Z was the novel about the fictional zombie apocalypse. Zombie Survival Guide was written,
wasn't it?
I think so, yeah. And it tells the story of like the reconstruction of humanity afterwards, whereas Zombie Survival Guide, I think, was really presented as if it was a serious document, like that in the world of World War Z, the Zombie Survival Guide exists and is like printed and handed around. Like if you're in that world, you've definitely been familiar with this. It is your Bible in the world of World War Z, I think.
But this was definitely World War Z, because I remember the authors, how we beat the zombie hordes was basically just taken straight from Napoleonic warfare. He was like, yeah, we just have guys stand in a box. And
riflemen in a box formation. And they have this custom gun that they made where every bullet is exploding incendiary. And it's like, yeah, they just stand there. They have ranks and they just shoot zombies in the head with these I think they call them cherry pie bullets. Oh man!
It's like, all right, fair enough. Like it's entertaining. I'll take it.
Yeah, that's World War Z is a fun zombie story. The Zombie Survival Guide is just a pack of lies.
Well, that's honestly something I kind of miss. Okay, here's a rant. Millennials and Gen Z love to talk about FUD lore, making fun of baby boomers. And yet they have done literally the exact same thing, just with a slightly newer set of myths. Like nothing has changed. Time is a flat circle. All we've done is found a new group of old men to make fun of and propagate the exact, because I mean, I'm sure you can think of the same sort of like modern internet, I guess what would you say, like rules of thumb, right? That are just equally as wrong. And it drives me nuts because you mentioned much earlier in the discussion this sort of like Reddit performative outrage, but you see the exact same thing. There are these sort of like unwritten rules that you just, or not even unwritten, but rules you don't violate, and you will induce a massive chimp out if even for a very good reason you sort of like bend or modify them. Like the easiest example to hand is the Reddit finger, right? The like very performatively like sticking your finger like ludicrously far away from the trigger just so you can be one of the cool good guys who knows about safety. And obviously that's something else. But at the same time, it drives me nuts, that whole conversation, because again, it's like we have not moved on. Like this exact same thing still happens. I'm sure you can think of a couple examples of that kind of like modern day flood lore, right?
Oh yeah. Yeah. Nothing's springing to mind immediately, but I've definitely noticed that when I go back and read like old magazines, that's something I started collecting recently, is trying to learn or trying to find information about old stuff. It's difficult just to begin with, but there's also the aspect of how was this received at the time, or how was it perceived at the time? So I'm interested not just in just basic facts about guns, like what year did it come out, because that's often hard to figure out, but also like what do people actually think about this? And what I've learned is that nothing changes. That then 30 years ago, as now, there were shill articles and there were real reviewers. Like you can read reviews of a gun that is now historically recognized as being dog shit, like the Colt Double Eagle, for example. I go back, I have a bunch of magazines from the era with articles, and in some of them, you can tell the guy's like a serious, probably a pretty good shooter, a very serious reviewer, and he's pointing out all of the flaws with the gun. And another one, the guy's just like, whoa, cool, new gun, this is the best thing. And you're like, that's just 35-year-old magazine slop content. It's literally no different. So people are like, everything's just like, just an advertisement, just third-party advertising. It's just slop. You're like, everything has always just been slop, man. Like the nuggets, the diamonds in the rough will always exist. They're always going to be there. But the mainstream is just going to be people who are like, whoa, this is awesome. It's cool. It's new.
Well, I feel like you see the same thing. I spent a lot of time on forums as a kid. Learned a lot about a lot of things. For instance, learned how to swear from random forums, which is a very cool thing to pick up at 9. But point is, there is this sort of like rose-tinted glasses of looking back and only remembering just the best information, right? The thing that you found that was exactly what you needed. But if you're sorting chronologically, like you're digging for something kind of specific in like a 80 to 100 post thread, you realize, no, this was just as much garbage. It's just slightly easier to search garbage, which I'll admit is an advantage, right? Is why I keep going back to those forums. But people treated those exactly like red.
Yeah, you can find flame wars between two 55-year-old men who are just like, and they're doing the same Reddit thing. They're like the point-by-point rebuttal of the post. They're like, you called me this. It's like, I didn't call you that. It's like, well, you implied it. Well, I didn't imply anything. And you're like, the thread is about like, what's the ballistic coefficient of a cartridge, and it's just two retired guys just like sniping at each other as if it was Reddit.
My favorite,
Nothing
this
changes.
is a very specific one, but there's a couple of really early 6.5 Grendel threads on Sniper's Hide that are just pure rage on all sides. It's just like a war of all against all, debating completely irrelevant points. And my favorite one, I wish I could find it, but it's the classic listing out which logical fallacies you have used in response to, as you've said, a very niche discussion of like ballistic coefficients of like what was then a largely experimental round. And it's like, you know what? The internet never changes. It's just a constant.
Yeah, the enthusiasts are nuts. There is a lot of like, secret, hidden, juicy details on there. Like I always search AR15.com, ARFCOM, anytime I'm trying to find, the historical record, or like, what did people think about this at the time? Which takes a lot of searching because the internet's busted now. But what I've also figured out is that it's really tough to trust people's memory of what happened, because a lot of people don't remember years particularly well. I mean, we had a hard time. We talked about Sandy Hook earlier. I don't remember what year that happened. If you asked me, I'd say 2012, but I might be wrong. So it's like,
let's go with that, because I also don't remember.
Yeah, or maybe it's 2014. But you see on like forums, or you ask people, I receive comments from this all the time where they're like, I was there. You know, like I will have comments from people being like, I had one of these back in 1976. And I'm like, that company didn't exist until 1989. So what is it that you think you remember? Like, you're confused. I'm sorry, sir. Like, the historical record may be off slightly, but it's not off by that much. So you remember, or you've constructed a memory that it's just untrue. And you can find all that stuff there. So just because it's on ARPCom doesn't mean it's true. Although most of the time, ARPCom's pretty good.
Well, and that's sort of the sad thing about, whether you want to call it like dead internet theory or whatever, but you mentioned earlier the internet getting more and more broken is it, and regardless of your area of interest, if you dig deep enough, you'll very quickly realize you've sort of like gone into the geologic table like too far back. Like it's just bedrock, it's gone. And it is sort of a sad thing because, and again, this is very much the kind of rose-colored glasses, but I remember the time which if you wanted to find something, it was almost undoubtedly there. And to have something not just not have a record of it, right? We don't know, but to be like, oh, we did know like 3 years ago, but they stopped paying for the domain, so it's all gone. It's sort of a haunting thing when you're looking for something and it's just like, oh, it's just a ghost now.
Yeah, and I don't usually try this. Maybe it's possible. I use like the Internet Archive a lot to find old versions of stuff. But like my favorite is to find old versions of manufacturer websites. You go to EOTech's website, you go to their Red Dots page or their Reflex Sites page or whatever. They've probably done a pretty good job of keeping that link consistent, and they just update that page. So the URL, if you put it into the Wayback Machine, go back 15 years, it's going to be an active page on their website with products from 15 years ago. So like you can learn a lot of stuff there, but like you used to be able to Google something or just search, whatever Metacrawler, whatever your search engine of choice was, and you'd get pages of handcrafted enthusiast content, essentially. Like there used to be like, I remember when I was a kid, you could go Google Perfect Dark and there were like a dozen fan websites, just homemade websites, Angel Fire, GeoCities, whatever, all these little like niche hosting services. And people would like have secrets. They have screenshots. They'd be like, here's the secret on this level. Here's, how to beat this level. Here's how to get this achievement or whatever, like in unlock cheat codes in GoldenEye or something. I don't know if those websites exist. I assume they don't because they were on weird fly-by-night hosting services that either don't exist anymore or somebody stopped paying for them. So the website's probably gone. They may be on the Internet Archive, but I don't know how to find them because I don't remember what the specific, geocities.pd fan page.joy or whatever, like some weird URL. I can't remember them. I didn't write them down. I feel like a lot of this stuff would be cool to see again, but we're never going to see it again.
Well, and I think that the trend, over the entire life of the internet has been towards consolidation, right? And when with that consolidation comes that sort of like massification where, much like the sort of like really bizarre like Chinese movies that you see every once in a while where it's like, this is a movie made for like 40% of the globe. So it's not really about anything. It has no like cultural touchstones. It's sort of just generalized entertainment, right? Like you can imagine it being like almost industrially produced. But there's been a similar thing with any one of these sort of interests, these hobbies, where, as it goes kind of higher and higher up the food chain, gets to bigger and bigger as kind of like aggregation sites, the sort of specifics about like, okay, well, let's say you're in a forum of 1,000 people. Obviously, there's a pyramid, 90% lurkers. So we say of 100 active users, half of them are stupid. So that means you've got 50 people. Okay, those are 50 people that you may not know them personally, but that's well under Dunbar's number, right? That's a group of people you can sort of weigh their opinions on anything. Whereas, okay, now you're on, let's just say the AR-15. Do you say boards on Reddit? I don't use Reddit enough to know the terminology. Subreddit? That's the right word.
Subreddit.
Yeah, I probably could have figured that out if I thought a little bit about it. But that's one, completely open to the public. And two, how many users are on that? I assume tens of thousands.
Yep.
And so if you were interested in something very, very specific, not just, the whole big topic, well, your ability to find that information quickly is largely gone. And regardless of whatever your hobby is, you sort of see the same thing that as it gets more popular, though there's certainly benefits to that, but you sort of lose the resolution. right? It becomes more and more difficult to find the specific information. And obviously, as kind of social media has passed me by and there are new and scary forms of technology that I don't understand, that trend just kind of continues apace. Like the moment I realized I was old is when I started seeing gun ASMR TikToks re-uploaded to YouTube. And I was like, I not only don't understand,
Like, none of those words are in the Bible.
Yeah, exactly. When King James wrote the Bible, he never said any of those. And so, but sorry.
Block 19.
Yeah, fair enough. Well, dude, this was, I guess, sort of a more morbid note to end things on, but we're fast approaching time. If people want to find you and your work, what's a good way for them to do that?
Yeah, your best bet is to go to YouTube and search Hop Night Vision, because that'll drill it down pretty far. If you just search Hop, you're going to find this weird, like, animated kids show channel about a rabbit. That's not me.
I assumed that's what the dog whistle was for. That this was like a secret furry thing.
Oh no, I wish that'd be a lot more well accepted among the aforementioned subreddit.
Than being a marathon fag.
Exactly. You're like, I'm still embarrassed. I don't have a Macintosh copy of Marathon 2. I have the PC box, and it's square. It's not triangular, so it really does look out of place. So I am a fake Marathon fan.
See, this is exactly, I mean, speaking of kids not understanding yesterday's technology, effectively, GoldenEye I can get. It was a little before my time, but I've got it. Marathon, I felt like I was like they were asking me to speak Mandarin. I was like, what are these controls? What am I doing? And so I gave up.
Impenetrable would be a good way to describe it. I'm absolutely adore Marathon. It's a fantastic game. And people try to compare it to Doom, which is its biggest contemporary, and it just doesn't compare to Doom, because Doom has no story. Marathon has always story. Doom has phenomenal gameplay and level design. Marathon has perfunctory gameplay and mixed level design. Some levels are okay. A lot of them are not great. So playing Marathon is hostile. Like, it is, even if you play on an easy difficulty, it just doesn't feel right. Whereas I feel like almost anybody could play Doom, even with the old school Doom controls, and be like, this is fluid and awesome. So yeah, it's not that you had to be there. It's just that you have to look well beyond the presentation and the surface level aspects of the game. And I don't like remakes, but I think Marathon maybe could use a remake, not this weird extraction shooter nonsense that they're probably going to fail to come out with anyway. So yeah,
it's sort of an interesting point, and not to drag us back into deep esoteric internet waters, but to your point about barrier to entry, it was sort of the same thing in an earlier era of the internet, when both actually getting on the internet was a difficult thing to do, relatively speaking, and also to both get to and contribute to a discussion around a topic required some effort. Like, don't get me wrong, as we've said earlier, there was still plenty of garbage out there, but it was sort of a filtering mechanism on the front end to keep out at least some amount of nonsense that you see now. I know, it's sort of an interesting thing. Your comparison from Doom to Marathon, it's completely off topic. Sort of my exact feelings about the Dark Messiah games, the Heroes of Might and Magic games, and the Elder Scrolls games. But this is a conversation for another time, that if 50% of my audience is interested in guns, 0% is interested, in my opinion, on early 2000s computer RPG games. But anyway, I'll be sure to link your stuff in the description. It was a good conversation, man. Thanks for coming on.
Absolutely. Thanks for having me.
If you like my stuff, the best way to support it is to find me on Apple, Spotify, YouTube, anywhere you listen to podcasts. If you want to support us, Axios Remote and Fish. I'll edit that out. Axios Remote Fitness and Coaching is our sponsor. Sure to check them out. JD is an absolute animal, intimidating human being, and you wouldn't want to make him angry. Again, Hop, I appreciate it. And everyone, keep your head up. Life can't last forever. Good night.